I am taking control of everything, my sister announced to the board. The family members in the room cheered, raising their glasses to their new chief executive officer. I just watched quietly from the back of the room. Then the chief financial officer stood up, adjusted his glasses, and looked right at my sister. Ma'am, any changes to this company require the approval of the 90% shareholder. My sister scoffed and said our father was dead, and we owned it all. That is when he pointed at me and revealed the truth she never saw coming. My name is Cassidy. I am 33 years old, and this is the story of how my family tried to steal an empire I already owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member who underestimated your worth. The black luxury cars pulled away from the cemetery, leaving my father in the cold ground and transporting us back to the reality of the Reynolds family estate. It was a sprawling suburban mansion in Connecticut, a place that always felt more like a museum of my mother's vanity than a home. Just 2 hours after we buried my father, the grand living room was filled with caterers carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and guests murmuring in hushed tones. There were no real tears being shed. The atmosphere was not heavy with grief, but buzzing with the quiet, calculated energy of a corporate networking event. People were already looking toward the future, specifically toward who would take the reins of my father's manufacturing company. I stood alone near the massive bay windows holding a glass of sparkling water. I wore a simple black suit, my posture straight, my expression unreadable. In my line of work as a mergers and acquisitions specialist on Wall Street, showing emotion was a liability. I had learned long ago to lock my feelings in a vault, a skill that proved incredibly useful when dealing with my family. Across the room, my 36-year-old sister Lauren was holding court. She wore a designer black dress that looked more appropriate for a fashion gala than a funeral. Lauren held the fabricated title of Vice President of Brand Strategy at my father's company, a role created entirely to justify her massive salary and limitless expense account. Beside her stood her husband Jamal. At 38, Jamal was an African-American venture capitalist whose public image was built entirely on flashy suits, luxury cars, and aggressive confidence. He liked to project the aura of a self-made billionaire, but I knew how to read balance sheets. I knew his investment fund was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. He stood behind Lauren with his hands resting possessively on her shoulders, acting as if he were the new patriarch of the Reynolds family. They whispered to each other, their eyes occasionally darting in my direction with thinly veiled contempt. I was the scapegoat of this family. I was the child who preferred studying financial models over attending country club mixers. My mother, Catherine, had never forgiven me for choosing the grueling, unglamorous hours of a Wall Street career over the polished, dependent lifestyle she had envisioned for me. She viewed my independence as a personal insult. In her eyes, Lauren was the golden child, the perfect daughter, who stayed close to home, married a flashy businessman, and maintained the illusion of suburban perfection. The last of the guests finally began to filter out, leaving only the immediate family and a few scattered caterers cleaning up the dining room. I placed my glass on a side table, preparing to make a quiet exit and head back to my apartment in the city. I had a closing call for a major acquisition the next morning, and I had no desire to linger in this toxic environment. Before I could reach the grand foyer, my mother intercepted me. Catherine was 62, her face pulled tight with expensive cosmetic procedures, and her posture rigid with lifelong entitlement. She did not offer a hug. She did not ask how I was coping with the loss of my father. Instead, she marched directly up to me and slammed a heavy cream-colored envelope onto the marble entryway table. I looked down at it, then back up at her. She crossed her arms, her eyes flashing with a cold, demanding authority. The catering, the floral arrangements, the premium casket, the private security for the cemetery. It all adds up to $45,000. She stated the number as if she were ordering a coffee. I stared at the invoice, my face completely neutral. "You want me to pay for the funeral?" Jamal and Lauren have their assets tied up in a massive European real estate deal right now, my mother said, her tone dripping with defensive superiority. They are handling the big picture for this family. You work on Wall Street. You have the cash sitting around. You pay for it. Lauren strolled over, linking her arm through Jamal's, an arrogant smirk playing on her lips. It is the least you can do, Cassidy, she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. You are the only one who did not shed a single tear today anyway. You might as well contribute something useful. Jamal chuckled, adjusting his gold watch. Come on, Cassidy. Do not be cheap. Show some respect for the man who gave you everything. I looked at the three of them. A mother who saw me as an open checkbook, a sister who spent her life taking credit for my father's hard work, and a brother-in-law who was desperate to hide his own financial ruin. They thought they were putting me in my place. They thought demanding this money would humiliate me, would remind me of my obligation to the family hierarchy. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. I did not argue. I did not defend my grief or explain that my tears had been shed privately in the hospital room, holding my father's hand while Lauren and Jamal were out shopping for funeral outfits. Arguments were a waste of breath with these people. I reached into my tailored jacket, pulled out my solid black American Express card, and dropped it onto the marble table right next to the invoice. The heavy metal card hit the stone with a satisfying, authoritative clink. Pay it, I said, my voice dangerously calm and entirely void of warmth. Consider it my final contribution to this household. My mother snatched the card, looking momentarily surprised by my lack of resistance, but that surprise quickly morphed into smug satisfaction. She thought she had won. She thought my silent compliance was a sign of submission. She turned away to hand the card to her assistant, completely unaware that she had just ignited a war she could not possibly win. I buttoned my jacket and looked at Lauren and Jamal one last time. Their smug smiles were permanently etched into my memory. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they were about to inherit a kingdom. But I knew the truth about the company's finances, and I knew exactly what was coming for them. I turned to leave, ready to put this suffocating estate behind me. But before my hand could reach the heavy brass handle of the front doors, heavy footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor behind me. I paused and turned slowly. Jamal emerged from the hallway that led to the private residential wing of the mansion. He was struggling slightly, holding a medium-sized battered cardboard box sealed with cheap peeling packing tape. The sight of him doing manual labor in his bespoke tailored suit was almost laughable, but the malicious glint in his dark eyes told me this was a carefully calculated performance. He marched straight toward me, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the imported marble. When he reached the entryway, he did not hand the box to me. Instead, he lifted his arms and let it drop directly at my feet. The cardboard hit the floor with a hollow, heavy thud, raising a small puff of dust in the pristine foyer. The tape split open at the corner, revealing the contents inside. It was a collection of my old high school debate trophies, a few worn sketchbooks, and a framed photograph of my father and me from a rare afternoon we had spent together. These were the absolute last childhood items I had left in my old bedroom. Jamal straightened up, brushing invisible dust off his lapels. He shot a look at Lauren, who was now leaning against the archway of the living room with a fresh glass of champagne in her hand. Lauren wants to knock down your old room by the end of the week, Jamal announced, his voice booming so the remaining caterers could hear him. We are expanding the East Wing to build a billiards lounge for our kids. It is time we cleared out the dead weight in this house to make room for the actual future of this family. Lauren took a delicate sip of her drink and nodded in agreement. It was taking up entirely too much prime real estate, Cassidy. You understand, right? We need a proper entertainment space for hosting clients. You have not lived here in over a decade anyway. It is just practical property management. I looked down at the box, my expression completely flat. Jamal mistook my silence for submission. He took a step closer, invading my personal space, towering over me, to use his physical presence as an intimidation tactic. Oh, and one more thing, he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still entirely loud enough for my mother to hear. Do not bother coming to the corporate office tomorrow morning, or ever again for that matter. I tilted my head slightly, maintaining direct eye contact with him. Is that so? I asked evenly. Jamal smirked, adjusting the heavy gold Rolex on his left wrist. It caught the light of the grand chandelier above us, a blinding flash of borrowed wealth. Yes, that is so. Lauren and I are officially taking over the Chief Executive Officer seat tomorrow. We are implementing a massive restructuring plan across the board. My investment fund will be stepping in to guide Reynolds Industries into the modern era. We do not need some overly analytical Wall Street number cruncher second-guessing our creative vision. He reached into his tailored pocket and pulled out a small plastic card. It was my corporate security badge. He tossed it callously onto the cardboard box at my feet. I had the security team deactivate your access 20 minutes ago. You are locked out of the building, locked out of the servers, and locked out of this family business. Go back to New York, Cassidy. We have everything handled here. My mother, Catherine, had been watching this entire exchange from the center of the foyer. Instead of intervening, instead of showing even a sliver of maternal decency on the day she buried her husband, she actually clapped her hands together. The sound was sharp and jarring in the large, echoing space. That is exactly what this family needs, Catherine declared, her face beaming with twisted pride. She walked over and patted Jamal firmly on the arm, treating him like a conquering hero. This is what an alpha business mindset looks like. Your father was a good man, but he was far too cautious at the end. He let the business stagnate because he was afraid of taking risks. Jamal and Lauren have the bold, aggressive vision required to take Reynolds Industries global. They know how to leverage assets. They know how to play the game. Leverage assets. The phrase almost made me burst into laughter right then and there. Jamal did not know the first thing about leveraging assets. His entire venture capital firm was a hollow shell propped up by high-interest loans, fraudulent vendor invoices, and terrible market investments. He was a sinking ship, and he was desperately trying to anchor himself to my father's manufacturing company to keep from drowning in his own debt. And my mother, blinded by her obsession with country club status and the glamorous illusion of wealth, was eagerly handing him the drill to sink us all. I looked at the three of them standing together, a trinity of arrogance, entitlement, and profound financial ignorance. They truly believed they had outsmarted me. They believed that by throwing my childhood memories onto the floor and deactivating a simple piece of plastic, they had stripped me of my power. They expected me to argue. They expected me to cry, to beg for my position, to threaten them with a pointless lawsuit. They wanted a reaction because an emotional reaction would mean they had successfully hurt me. I absolutely refused to give them the satisfaction. I slowly bent down at the knees, keeping my back perfectly straight, and picked up the heavy cardboard box. The weight of the metal trophies shifted inside, clinking against the glass frame of my father's photograph. I reached down with my free hand and tucked the deactivated security badge into my jacket pocket. I stood back up, adjusting my grip on the box, my face remaining a mask of absolute calm. I looked directly into Jamal's eyes, holding his arrogant gaze until he shifted his weight uncomfortably. I did not blink. I did not frown. I simply stared at him with the cold, calculating precision of a predator, observing a very loud, very oblivious prey. Enjoy the billiards lounge, I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and perfectly controlled. And good luck with your major restructuring plan tomorrow, Jamal. I am sure it will be a day none of you will ever forget. I turned my back on them and walked out the heavy front doors. I did not slam the door behind me. I closed it gently, stepping out into the crisp, cool evening air. The massive circular driveway was empty, save for my sleek black sedan. I walked down the stone steps, my heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement, carrying the boxed remnants of my past, while my mind rapidly shifted to the immediate future. I placed the box in the trunk of my car, shut it firmly, and slid into the driver's seat. I did not start the engine right away. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I knew by heart. The phone rang twice before a tired, familiar voice answered on the other end. David. It is Cassidy. I said, staring up at the lit windows of the mansion. Yes, Cassidy. I am so sorry about your father today. David Thorne, the chief financial officer of Reynolds Industries, replied. His voice was heavy with exhaustion. He was the only person in that company who actually understood the books. Thank you, David, I replied briskly, cutting straight to business. But we do not have time for condolences. They are making their move tomorrow morning. Bring the Apex Holdings files to the boardroom. Let them play their hand first, then lock the doors. I heard David exhale a long, shaky breath on the other end of the line. Are you sure about this, Cassidy? It is going to be a bloodbath. I gripped the steering wheel, a cold, genuine smile finally touching my lips. I am absolutely sure, David. See you at 9. I ended the call with David Thorne and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. The engine purred to life, a quiet hum contrasting sharply with the chaotic toxicity of the estate in my rearview mirror. David was a loyal chief financial officer who spent 20 years keeping my father's manufacturing company from drowning in red ink. But loyalty often breeds fear, and David was terrified of my mother and Lauren. He knew what they were capable of when their lavish lifestyle was threatened. I, however, was not afraid of them. In Wall Street mergers and acquisitions, I dealt with corporate predators who would eat someone like Jamal for breakfast. As I drove down the winding streets of the wealthy Connecticut suburb, my mind shifted into pure analytical mode. Apex Holdings, LLC, was the ace up my sleeve. It was a discrete corporate entity I created 14 months ago for one specific purpose: to save Reynolds Industries from the catastrophic debt my sister and brother-in-law had secretly accumulated. They thought they had successfully hidden their financial crimes from my father. They thought they were skimming off the top to fund Jamal's failing venture capital firm and Lauren's endless obsession with European designer brands. They were completely wrong. My father discovered the missing millions, and the stress of their betrayal triggered the stroke that led to his rapid decline. The drive back to my apartment in Manhattan took exactly 47 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. I preferred the silence. Silence allowed me to organize my strategy without distraction. I parked in my building's underground garage and took the private elevator up to my floor. My apartment was a stark contrast to my mother's sprawling suburban mansion. There were no useless crystal chandeliers or gaudy gold accents. It was sleek, modern, and funded by my own grueling 80-hour work weeks. It was a fortress built on pure merit, not emotional manipulation or privilege. I walked directly into my home office and booted up my encrypted terminal. The glowing screens illuminated the dark room displaying the financial autopsy of Reynolds Industries. I pulled up the digitized ledger David had securely transmitted to me over a year ago. It was a masterpiece of corporate negligence. Millions of dollars had bled dry through shell companies and fake vendor invoices, all authorizing signatures pointing right back to Lauren and Jamal. They had treated the family business like a bottomless personal cash register. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the physical binder labeled Apex Holdings. This was the exact binder I had instructed David to bring to the boardroom tomorrow morning. Inside were the legally binding stock transfer agreements, fully notarized and stamped by state regulators and federal tax authorities. When banks were preparing to aggressively foreclose on the manufacturing plant and seize my mother's estate to cover massive defaults, I had stepped in. I did not do it out of love for my mother or my sister. I did it because my father begged me to save the jobs of the 300 factory workers who depended on Reynolds Industries to feed their families. I liquidated my entire stock portfolio, cashed out my Wall Street bonuses, and leveraged my professional reputation to buy the toxic debt outright. I became the bank. I became the sole majority shareholder. I legally owned 90% of the equity, effectively making me the dictator of the company. My father had signed the transfer willingly, weeping with relief that the workers would be spared. We kept it a strict secret. We knew that if Lauren and Jamal found out they no longer had access to the company accounts, they would destroy whatever remaining assets were left out of spite. I spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing every single line item for tomorrow's trap. I anticipated Jamal's every possible legal maneuver. He would try to claim elder abuse. He would try to say the stock transfer was forged or coerced. I countered those arguments by having independent medical examiners and 3 external auditors verify the transaction 14 months ago. The trap was mathematically flawless. It was a titanium net, and tomorrow morning, Jamal and Lauren were going to march right into the center of it. I finally closed the heavy binder at exactly 2 in the morning. I slept for exactly 4 hours, a luxury in my line of work. When my alarm went off at 6, I rose with absolute clarity. I showered, pulled my hair back into a sleek style, and put on a charcoal gray tailored suit. It was my armor. Today was not about mourning. Today was about executing a corporate takeover. The drive back to Connecticut during the morning rush hour felt electric with dark anticipation. I arrived at the Reynolds Industries corporate headquarters at 8:45. The building was a massive brick and glass structure my father had built from the ground up through decades of sweat equity. I pulled into the underground executive parking garage. My deactivated security badge meant I could not use the main lobby elevators, but David discreetly left the secure freight elevator unlocked for me. I rode up to the executive floor in silence, stepping out into the back hallway just behind the main boardroom. Through the heavy oak doors, I could hear the muffled sounds of corporate sycophants laughing and chatting. The board of directors, mostly old friends of my mother who cared more about golf handicaps than profit margins, were settling into their leather chairs. I checked my watch. The digital face read 8:58. Lauren and Jamal would be taking the stage in exactly 2 minutes to announce their grand delusion. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, my heart beating in a steady rhythm. I was not the discarded scapegoat anymore. I was the owner. I was about to teach them exactly what a real alpha business mindset truly looked like in practice. I pushed open the heavy oak doors just as the clock struck 9. The sound of the latch clicking into place was completely swallowed by the self-important chatter filling the executive boardroom. I slipped into an empty leather chair at the far back corner of the room, positioning myself in both the physical and metaphorical shadows. Nobody noticed my arrival. The board of directors, a collection of my mother's country club friends and aging golf partners, were far too busy fawning over the new self-appointed queen of the empire. Lauren stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, occupying the exact chair where my father had conducted business for over 3 decades. She was dressed in a blindingly bright red designer suit, an outfit that screamed for attention and projected an artificial authority. She looked less like a corporate executive and more like a reality television star, playing the role of a chief executive officer. Her hair was perfectly blown out, and her makeup was flawless, ready for the cameras she probably expected to arrive to document her coronation. Standing directly behind her, casting a tall shadow over her chair, was Jamal. He wore a navy blue pinstripe suit that cost more than most of the factory workers made in a month. He had his hands resting on the back of Lauren's leather chair, leaning down occasionally to whisper instructions into her ear. He looked exactly like what he was, a puppet master pulling the strings of a very vain, very financially illiterate marionette. My mother, Catherine, sat to Lauren's right, beaming with a sickeningly proud smile. She had a cup of premium coffee in her hand and nodded at everything Lauren did, clearly reveling in the illusion that her favorite daughter was now a high-powered business mogul. Across the table sat David Thorne. Our chief financial officer looked physically ill. His face was pale, and his hands were resting rigidly on top of the thick Apex Holdings binder I had instructed him to bring. He caught my eye from across the long room. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. The instruction was clear. Let them play their entire hand. Let them commit to the fraud on the official corporate record before we drop the guillotine. Lauren cleared her throat, tapping a silver pen against her crystal water glass to command the room. "Thank you all for being here this morning," she began, her voice projecting a rehearsed theatrical confidence. "As you know, we are navigating a difficult transition after the passing of my father. However, business does not stop for grief. Reynolds Industries has stagnated for far too long. We have been stuck in the past, weighed down by outdated operational models and bloated overhead. Today, as your new acting chief executive officer, I am implementing a comprehensive strategic restructuring initiative. She clicked a remote, and the large presentation screen behind her lit up with a sleek, minimalist slide deck. The title read, Strategic Asset Liquidation. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs, analyzing every word she spoke. In the world of mergers and acquisitions, I translated corporate buzzwords for a living. Strategic restructuring coming from someone like Lauren meant only one thing: a smash and grab robbery. Our primary focus must be agility. Lauren continued pacing slightly to ensure everyone was looking at her. To achieve that, we need to trim the fat. And our biggest liability right now is the Ohio manufacturing plant. I felt a cold spike of anger hit my chest, but my face remained perfectly neutral. The Ohio plant was not a liability. It was the beating heart of Reynolds Industries. It was a state-of-the-art facility that generated over 50% of our physical product output. It was the exact plant my father had begged me to save when the company was drowning in the debt Lauren and Jamal had secretly created. Calling it a dinosaur was not just factually incorrect, it was a deliberate lie designed to justify a massive theft. Manufacturing physical goods is a dying paradigm, Lauren proclaimed using words Jamal had undoubtedly fed to her over breakfast. We need to pivot to digital supply chain management and brand licensing. Therefore, my first executive decision is to divest from the Ohio facility immediately. A murmur went through the board of directors. A few of the older men exchanged confused glances, likely wondering how a manufacturing company was supposed to survive without its main manufacturing plant. But none of them had the spine to challenge Catherine Reynolds' daughter. They were yes men paid handsomely to rubber stamp decisions and enjoy the catered board lunches. Fortunately, Lauren smiled, gesturing toward Jamal with an elegant sweep of her hand. We have secured a highly lucrative, fast-tracked buyout. Jamal's venture capital firm Vanguard Horizon has generously offered to take this burdensome asset off our hands. They specialize in liquidating distressed industrial properties, and they are willing to expedite the acquisition process to inject immediate capital into our new branding division. Jamal stepped forward, offering a slick, practiced smile to the room. We consider it a favor to the family, he said, his voice smooth as oil. We want to see Reynolds Industries thrive in its new direction. Vanguard Horizon is prepared to assume all operational liabilities of the Ohio plant effective today. And the purchase price, one of the braver board members asked mildly. Lauren clicked to the next slide. $5 million in a direct cash transfer, she announced proudly. I almost let out a dark, cynical laugh. $5 million. The Ohio plant, even fully depreciated, was appraised at $35 million on a bad day. Selling it for $5 million was not a business deal. It was a blatant, highly illegal scheme to launder corporate assets directly into Jamal's bankrupt venture capital fund. They were going to sell a $35 million asset for pennies, take the $5 million in cash to supposedly fund Lauren's fake branding division, and let Jamal's firm instantly flip the Ohio real estate to a third-party buyer to cover his own massive hidden debts. It was wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and a massive breach of fiduciary duty, all wrapped up in a pretty PowerPoint presentation. They were literally stealing the company blind in broad daylight right in front of the board of directors, and my mother was sitting there clapping her hands. This is a brilliant move, Catherine declared, looking around the table to ensure the board agreed with her. It frees up Lauren to focus on the luxury market expansion. We need a motion to approve this sale immediately so Jamal's team can begin the paperwork. Lauren nodded, placing her hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning forward to project absolute authority. Let us finalize this today and move Reynolds Industries into the future. I am calling for an immediate board vote to authorize the transfer of the Ohio plant to Vanguard Horizon. All those in favor. The hands of the loyalist directors began to slowly rise into the air. They were signing off on their own legal destruction without even reading the balance sheets. I kept my eyes locked on David Thorne. The chief financial officer looked like he was about to have a heart attack. The sweat was visibly beading on his forehead. He looked at me, desperation in his eyes, silently asking for permission to stop the madness. The trap was fully set. They had stated their intent. They had presented the fraudulent terms to the board. They had committed to the scheme on the official corporate record. I uncrossed my legs and sat forward in my leather chair. It was time. The hands around the mahogany table were fully raised, signaling a unanimous rubber stamp on the fraudulent sale of the Ohio manufacturing plant. A smattering of polite applause broke out among the directors. My mother clapped the loudest, her diamond rings catching the fluorescent light as she beamed at Lauren and Jamal. They were practically taking a victory bow at the front of the room. The arrogance in the air was thick and suffocating. Jamal leaned down and whispered something in Lauren's ear, making her laugh a sharp, triumphant sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. They thought the ink was already dry. They thought they had just secured $5 million of clean cash and a $35 million real estate asset to save their sinking personal empire. Then Lauren's gaze swept across the room to take in her captive audience. Her smile froze instantly. Her eyes locked onto mine in the dimly lit back corner of the executive boardroom. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face for a fraction of a second before being rapidly replaced by a flush of absolute unadulterated rage. She gripped the edges of the wooden podium tightly. The board members following the trajectory of her furious stare turned their heads one by one. The polite applause died out, replaced by a sudden tense silence. Even my mother stopped clapping, her jaw dropping slightly as she registered my presence. I simply sat there maintaining unbroken eye contact, my face a mask of absolute calm. I did not shrink under their collective gaze. I owned the room, and I was just waiting for them to figure it out. "What is she doing here?" Lauren demanded, her voice cracking like a whip across the silent room. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "I told security to deactivate her badge last night." "How did you get in here, Cassidy? This is a closed-door executive board meeting. You have absolutely no authorization to be on this floor, let alone in this room." Jamal puffed out his chest and took a heavy step forward, trying to physically intimidate me from 30 feet away. He pulled his smartphone from his tailored suit pocket. "I am calling building security right now," he announced loudly, making sure the board members heard him asserting control. "We are having you escorted off the premises for corporate trespassing." My mother, recovering from her initial shock, stood up from her chair and glared at me with sheer contempt. "Have you no shame, Cassidy?" Catherine scolded, using her best disappointed country club voice. "We laid your father to rest yesterday, and here you are sneaking into the building to spy on family business. You have always been so utterly disrespectful and bitter. Get out before Jamal has you thrown out in front of everyone." I did not move a single muscle. I let their threats hang in the dead air of the boardroom. The directors looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting in their expensive leather chairs, eager to avoid being caught in the crossfire of a messy family dispute. They expected me to stand up to yell back, to passionately defend myself against my mother's harsh words. But I knew that in the corporate world, the person who loses their temper loses the negotiation. I remained perfectly still, watching Jamal angrily tap the screen of his phone, desperately trying to summon a security detail that ultimately answered to me. Before Jamal could press the call button, a loud, heavy thud shattered the tension in the room. Every head snapped toward the center of the table. Chief Financial Officer David Thorne had stood up. He had taken the massive leather-bound Apex Holdings binder and slammed it down onto the polished mahogany table with both hands. The impact rattled the crystal water glasses and caused my mother to jump in her seat. David was trembling slightly, his knuckles white against the dark cover of the binder, but his jaw was set with absolute determination. He had spent his entire career being bullied by my mother's spending habits, and he was finally putting an end to it today. "Excuse me, ma'am," David said, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. He looked directly at Lauren, bypassing Jamal entirely. The board cannot authorize this sale today, or any other day for that matter. Lauren scoffed loudly, waving a dismissive hand at him, as if he were a confused intern rather than a veteran financial executive. David, sit down. You are out of line. The board just voted. The motion passed unanimously. We are finalizing the transfer of the Ohio plant to Vanguard Horizon immediately. You just need to process the wire transfers. Do not make me fire you on my first day as Chief Executive Officer. David did not sit down. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and opened the heavy binder to the first tab, revealing pages of densely typed legal documents bearing federal and state regulatory stamps. I cannot process any wire transfers, Miss Hayes David replied, using her married name to emphasize her lack of authority over the Reynolds legacy. Furthermore, that board vote you just conducted is completely legally void. Jamal stepped away from the podium and marched toward David, his face contorted with anger. What are you talking about? Thorne Jamal demanded, leaning over the table to intimidate the older man. We own the company. We dictate the asset transfers. If you refuse to execute the board's directive, we will have you brought up on charges for breach of fiduciary duty. You work for us. I work for Reynolds Industries. David shot back, finding a reserve of courage I had rarely seen him display. And according to the updated corporate bylaws, which are filed directly with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Board of Directors does not have the authority to liquidate core manufacturing assets unilaterally. He tapped a specific paragraph highlighted in yellow on the document in front of him. Any transfer of corporate assets exceeding $1 million requires the explicit written signature of the 90% majority shareholder. Without that signature, this entire meeting is nothing more than a social gathering. Lauren let out a sharp, mocking laugh that grated against my ears. She looked around at the board members, as if inviting them to share in the ridiculous joke of their incompetent chief financial officer. She slammed her hands down on the podium. Have you lost your mind, David? My father is dead. The estate passes directly to us. She pointed fiercely at her own chest, then gestured wildly toward my mother. My mother and I own 100% of this company. There is no phantom majority shareholder. We are the shareholders. Now call security and remove my sister from this building before I have you thrown out right alongside her. David did not flinch at the threat. Instead, he reached into the open binder and pulled out a stack of documents bearing the unmistakable watermarks of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the State Department of Revenue. He slid them across the polished mahogany surface toward the center of the table, where the closest board members could clearly read the bold print. Incorrect, David stated, his voice ringing with a newfound, unshakable authority. Your father did not leave this company to the estate. As of exactly 14 months ago, 90% of the controlling equity of Reynolds Industries was legally and irrevocably transferred to a private entity known as Apex Holdings Limited Liability Company. A collective gasp rippled through the boardroom. The older directors, the men who had just blindly raised their hands to authorize a fraudulent $5 million liquidation, suddenly leaned forward. Their eyes scanned the legal documents David had presented. The color began to drain from their faces as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. They had just attempted to sell a massive corporate asset without the actual owner's consent. Lauren stared at the papers, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to comprehend the complex legal jargon, but fully understanding the shift in power. Jamal grabbed the documents aggressively, his eyes darting frantically across the pages. He was searching for a loophole, a forgery, anything he could use to invalidate the transfer. He found nothing. The signatures were verified. The corporate seals were authentic. The transfer was absolute. But who owns Apex Holdings? My mother shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her expensive rings digging into her skin. David looked away from my mother and pointed directly to the back of the room. The sole managing director and 100% equity owner of Apex Holdings is sitting right there. He gestured toward me. Cassidy Reynolds is the majority shareholder of this corporation. Total suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom. The air grew so thick and heavy that it felt difficult to breathe. Every single head in the room slowly turned to face me in the back corner. The arrogant smirks had vanished. The dismissive glances were gone. I was no longer the invisible, disappointing daughter who had been banned from the corporate office. I was the absolute dictator of their financial reality. I stood up slowly, ensuring my movements were deliberate and completely unhurried. The sound of my leather heels striking the hardwood floor echoed like gunshots in the dead quiet of the room. I walked down the length of the massive mahogany table. The board members physically shrank back into their chairs as I passed them, suddenly terrified of making eye contact with the woman they had ignored for over a decade. I reached the head of the table, stopping just inches away from where Lauren and Jamal were standing frozen. I did not look at my mother. I kept my eyes locked on my sister, watching the terrifying realization wash over her perfectly contoured face. She was not the queen. She was a trespasser in my castle. I reached inside my tailored jacket and pulled out a thick folded document. It was the master copy of the corporate bylaws, the specific legal framework that outlined the absolute authority of the 90% shareholder. I dropped it onto the table right on top of Jamal's fraudulent sales contract. The heavy thud made Lauren flinch backward. "This company does not belong to the estate," I said, my voice echoing with icy precision. "This company does not belong to you, and it certainly does not belong to your husband's bankrupt venture capital fund. I own the assembly lines. I own the supply chains. I own the patents, the real estate, and the brand. I own every single chair in this room, including the one you are currently standing behind." Lauren was shaking visibly. Her entire grand illusion had just been shattered in front of her most vital audience. "You cannot do this," Lauren stammered, her voice high-pitched and desperate. "Daddy would never give you the company. He promised it to me. We are going to contest this in court. We will freeze the assets. You are stealing from your own family." I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the polished table, invading her space and dominating her completely. "You cannot contest a legitimate financial transaction, Lauren," I replied coldly. "But we will discuss the exact mechanics of my acquisition later. Right now, I have a pressing administrative issue to handle. As the majority shareholder and the legally recognized chief executive officer of Reynolds Industries, I am reviewing your performance as vice president of brand strategy." Lauren took a step back, bumping into Jamal, who was still staring at the undeniable legal documents in horror. I looked my sister up and down with absolute disgust, dismantling her completely. "Your very first action as a self-appointed executive was attempting to sell our core manufacturing plant to a distressed third-party fund for pennies on the dollar. You tried to liquidate a vital corporate asset just to cover your husband's personal debts. That is not just gross incompetence. That is a textbook definition of corporate sabotage. You have breached your fiduciary duty to this company and endangered the livelihood of our employees. Therefore, your employment at Reynolds Industries is terminated effective immediately. You are fired, Lauren. Clean out your desk and get out of my building." The board members sat completely paralyzed, unable to intervene or offer even a single word of defense for my sister. They realized that their own positions were now highly precarious. They had blindly supported a fraudulent scheme, and I had the power to replace every single one of them by the end of the business day. The dynamic in the room had irreversibly shifted from a celebratory coronation to a brutal corporate execution. Lauren opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The reality of her sudden unemployment and the complete loss of her status finally crashed down upon her, leaving her utterly speechless in the face of my absolute authority. Jamal's carefully cultivated facade of the sophisticated venture capitalist evaporated in a single fraction of a second. The realization that his financial lifeline had just been severed snapped whatever thin thread of self-control he possessed. He lunged forward from behind Lauren. His heavy hands slammed down onto the polished mahogany table with a violent, explosive force that made the crystal water pitchers vibrate. The sudden physical aggression caused several of the older board members to visibly flinch and push their leather chairs back away from the table. Jamal ignored them completely. He stepped around the podium and marched directly up to me. He closed the physical distance until he was standing mere inches from my face, towering over me, breathing heavily. He was trying to use his height and his fury to intimidate me into backing down, a tactic he had probably used countless times to bully weak corporate executives. His eyes were wide with a frantic, desperate rage. "You manipulated a dying man!" Jamal roared, his voice bouncing off the wood-paneled walls of the executive suite. His expensive cologne suddenly smelled sour, mixed with his nervous sweat. "You sneaked into his hospital room and took advantage of an old man suffering from severe dementia. You coerced him into signing away the family legacy because you knew you could never earn anything on your own. You stole this company from your mother and your sister." "My mother?" Catherine seized upon Jamal's narrative immediately. She stood up from her chair, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She is a monster!" Catherine shrieked to the paralyzed board of directors. "She hated her father. She hated all of us. She forged those documents or tricked him when his mind was gone. We are calling the police. We are having you arrested for elder abuse and corporate theft right now." I did not break eye contact with Jamal. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground perfectly still, my expression carved from absolute ice. In my years on Wall Street, I had faced down billionaire hedge fund managers, hostile takeover artists, and ruthless litigators. A panicked, over-leveraged fraudster like Jamal Hayes was entirely beneath my weight class. "I will drag you into federal court and destroy you." Jamal spat, his face twisted in a snarl. "I have the best legal team in the state of New York. We will freeze every single asset tied to Apex Holdings. We will file an injunction before the market closes today. We will strip you of your license, your career, and every penny you think you just stole. You are going to prison, Cassidy." I let him finish his tirade. I let the echoes of his empty threats fade into the stagnant air of the boardroom. The board members were watching me closely, waiting to see if the newly revealed 90% shareholder would crack under the pressure. "You can certainly try, Jamal," I replied, my voice steady, conversational, and entirely devoid of fear. "But let me save you a fortune in legal consultation fees." The medical evaluations confirming my father's absolute cognitive capacity were conducted by 3 independent board-certified neurologists on the exact morning the transfer was executed. The transaction was witnessed by 2 separate legal teams and a state-appointed notary. It was not a gift. It was a legally binding acquisition. You have absolutely no grounds for an injunction, and your threats of federal court are nothing more than the desperate flailing of a man who just realized his own venture capital fund is going to default on its loans by Friday. Jamal's jaw tightened. The mention of his failing fund struck the exact nerve I was aiming for. He knew I had done my homework. He knew that I knew he was broke. Lauren finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic, trembling whisper. "Mom, do something. Tell them to arrest her. She cannot do this to us. She cannot take my job." I did not wait for my mother to formulate another hysterical response. I reached into my tailored suit pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and tapped a single button on the screen. The heavy oak doors at the back of the boardroom swung open immediately. 4 large, heavily built men in dark corporate security uniforms stepped into the room. They were the executive security detail, and David Thorne had briefed them on the shift in corporate ownership precisely 10 minutes before the meeting began. They no longer answered to Lauren. They answered exclusively to me. "Gentlemen," I said, addressing the head of the security detail without taking my eyes off Jamal. "Miss Hayes and Mr. Hayes are no longer employees or authorized visitors of Reynolds Industries. My mother is also politely concluding her visit to our headquarters. Please escort all 3 of them off the corporate premises immediately. If they refuse to leave quietly, or if they attempt to access any computer terminals or physical files on their way out, you are authorized to involve local law enforcement for criminal trespassing." The security guards moved forward with brisk professional efficiency. They surrounded Jamal, Lauren, and Catherine, creating a physical barrier between them and the boardroom table. "Do not touch me!" Jamal barked, shoving one of the guards away. "I am walking out of here on my own. But mark my words, Cassidy. This is a declaration of war. You have no idea what I am capable of doing to you. I will burn your entire reputation to the ground." Lauren burst into humiliating, dramatic tears. She grabbed her designer handbag from the table, knocking over a crystal water glass in the process. Water spilled across the polished mahogany, ruining the presentation notes she had brought for her fake coronation. She looked at the board members, silently pleading for anyone to stand up and defend her. Not a single director moved. They all stared down at their legal pads, suddenly deeply interested in the blank pages. Catherine glared at me with a hatred so pure it could have frozen boiling water. "You are dead to me, Cassidy. You are no longer my daughter. You will rot in a jail cell for what you have done to your own blood." The security detail systematically guided the three of them toward the exit. I stood at the head of the table, my posture immaculate, and watched them go. I watched Jamal's furious posturing, Lauren's pathetic sobbing, and my mother's bitter rage. They were shoved out the heavy oak doors, their voices echoing down the executive hallway as they were forcibly marched toward the freight elevator. The heavy boardroom doors clicked shut, sealing them out of the empire forever. The silence that returned to the room was absolute. I slowly turned my attention back to the table. The board of directors looked at me with a mixture of profound shock and genuine terror. I walked over to the podium, picked up Lauren's discarded presentation remote, and turned off the projector. The screen displaying the fraudulent sale of the Ohio plant went entirely black. The battle lines were officially drawn, and the first major strike was a flawless victory. But I knew Jamal. I knew he was a desperate, dangerous man who would stop at nothing to save his own skin. The real war was only just beginning, and I was entirely prepared to destroy him. 48 hours later, Jamal launched his counter-offensive. He did not file a legal injunction as he had threatened in the boardroom. He knew any judge would throw out his case the second they verified the state regulator stamps on my ownership documents. If you cannot win in a court of law, you win in the court of public opinion. He utilized the last remaining asset his crumbling venture capital firm possessed, a network of aggressive public relations fixers and hungry financial journalists looking for a sensational story. The first strike landed on a Thursday morning. I was sitting at my glass desk in my Manhattan corner office reviewing the operational transition plans for Reynolds Industries. My smartphone buzzed with a customized Google alert. I clicked the notification, opening a link to a prominent financial gossip blog. The headline was written in bold, unforgiving letters. "Wall Street Vulture, Rob's Dying, Father Blind." I read the article with a cold, clinical detachment. The piece was a masterpiece of character assassination. It completely omitted the $12 million of toxic debt I had cleared and Lauren's embezzlement. Instead, it painted a harrowing, entirely fabricated picture of a ruthless corporate raider who had abandoned her family only to swoop in during her father's final dementia-ridden months. The article claimed I had coerced an elderly man into signing away a manufacturing empire. It included an anonymous quote, obviously from my mother, stating that my father had wept in his final days, realizing his youngest daughter had stolen the legacy meant for his grandchildren. By noon, the story had metastasized. It was picked up by mid-tier business publications and local news outlets. In the hyper-connected, gossip-driven ecosystem of high finance, a scandal involving elder abuse and corporate theft was absolute blood in the water. My firm thrived on discretion and aggressive negotiation. A public scandal of this magnitude was a direct threat to our brand. At exactly 1:15 in the afternoon, my office phone rang. It was the executive assistant to Harrison Vance, the senior managing partner of my mergers and acquisitions firm. Harrison wanted to see me in his office immediately. I entered Harrison's spacious office. He was standing by the window looking out over the New York skyline holding a tablet displaying one of the articles. Harrison was a ruthless pragmatist. He had mentored me and profited massively from my relentless work ethic, but I knew he possessed absolutely zero loyalty to anyone whose public image threatened the firm's bottom line. "We both know why I am here, Harrison," I said, remaining standing. "You have seen the hit pieces." He turned, placing this tablet on his desk. "The firm's public relations department has been fielding calls from financial journalists for the past 2 hours. They are asking for a statement regarding our star partner allegedly extorting a dying man for his manufacturing company. It is a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by my brother-in-law," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly level. "He is attempting to cover up his own corporate embezzlement by destroying my credibility. I have the irrefutable notarized documents proving the legal purchase of the equity. I saved the company from foreclosure. There was no coercion, and my father's medical records prove his cognitive competence at the time of the sale." Harrison sighed, leaning his hands on his desk. "I believe you, Cassidy. You are far too intelligent to commit amateur corporate theft. But my belief is entirely irrelevant to this situation. Our clients trust us with billions of dollars of their assets. They demand absolute integrity, or at the very least, the flawless illusion of it. We cannot have a senior partner managing sensitive acquisitions while her face is plastered across financial media under headlines accusing her of elder abuse. The optics are incredibly toxic." "You are suspending me," I stated. "We are placing you on indefinite administrative leave," Harrison corrected using the precise legal terminology designated by Human Resources. "Effective immediately. You will surrender your firm access, your corporate accounts, and your client portfolios to the transition team. Once you clear your name and this media circus completely evaporates, we can discuss your reinstatement. But right now, you are a radioactive liability to this firm." I felt a sharp, unfamiliar sting of genuine panic strike my chest, though I refused to let it show on my face. My career was not just a job, it was my armor. It was the fortress I had built brick by brick to protect myself from my family's relentless narrative that I was a cold, unlovable disappointment. My professional reputation was the only thing I truly valued, the only arena where my worth was measured in undeniable objective metrics. Jamal knew this. He had aimed directly for my throat. I did not argue with Harrison. Pleading was for the weak, and protesting would only make me look erratic. I simply nodded, maintaining my ironclad composure. "I understand the firm's position, Harrison. I will have this situation rectified shortly." I turned and walked out of his office, returning to my desk to pack my essential personal items. As I descended in the elevator to the street level, the reality of Jamal's strategy became crystalline. He was executing a siege. By orchestrating my suspension, he was cutting off my primary source of income and attempting to mentally break me. He calculated that if he destroyed my identity on Wall Street, I would become desperate. He assumed I would eventually surrender the 90% stake in Reynolds Industries in exchange for a public retraction and the restoration of my career. He thought stripping me of my title would leave me defenseless. He fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Taking away my corporate responsibilities did not make me vulnerable. It simply freed up 100% of my time and energy. Jamal had just removed my only distraction. I walked out onto the bustling Manhattan street, pulling my phone from my pocket. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to completely obliterate his empire. I rode the private elevator up to my penthouse with my mind operating at 1,000,000 miles an hour. The sudden suspension from my firm was a tactical blow I had not entirely anticipated, but panic is a useless emotion in the face of corporate warfare. I was actively calculating my next defensive maneuver, drafting a mental list of independent forensic accountants and federal regulators I needed to contact before the close of business. My apartment was my sanctuary. It was a fortress of steel glass and soundproof walls, high above the chaotic streets of Manhattan. I expected to step out of the elevator and find absolute silence, a quiet space, where I could assemble my legal arsenal. Instead, The brushed metal doors slid open to reveal my mother standing perfectly still in the private corridor. Catherine Reynolds wore a tailored black cashmere coat, a string of understated pearls, and oversized dark sunglasses pushed up into her carefully styled hair. She was dressed like a tragic, dignified widow straight out of a classic film, a performance she had clearly been perfecting since my father drew his last breath. She must have manipulated the daytime concierge, playing the card of the grieving mother, desperate to check on her suddenly suspended daughter. She did not look desperate, she looked venomous. I stepped out of the elevator, my leather bag gripped tightly in my hand. "You are trespassing, Catherine," I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the narrow corridor. "The concierge will be fired for letting you up here." My mother did not flinch. She stepped forward, effectively blocking the path to my front door. "I am not here for a social visit, Cassidy. I am here to offer you a way out of the absolute mess you have created." She reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. She held it out toward me like a weapon. It was a stock transfer agreement, hastily drafted but legally binding. I did not reach for the paper. I kept my hands firmly at my sides, studying her face. "You drove all the way from Connecticut to hand-deliver a surrender document?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely analytical. "You must be truly terrified of what Jamal has done to his own bank accounts." Catherine's eyes narrowed. Her facade of maternal dignity cracked, revealing the raw, calculating desperation underneath. "You are going to sign exactly 50% of the Reynolds Industries equity back over to Lauren," she demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh, commanding register. "You will sign it right now, and you will relinquish your position as the majority shareholder. In exchange, Jamal will call off his media contacts. Your firm will reinstate you by Monday morning, and we can all pretend this hostile takeover attempt of yours was just a massive misunderstanding." I looked at the paperwork in her trembling hand and let out a short, humorless laugh. 50%. You want me to hand over 50% of the voting power to a woman who just tried to sell a $35 million manufacturing plant for $5 million to save her husband's fraudulent venture capital firm. If I give Lauren 50%, she and Jamal will have the leverage to block my executive decisions. They will drain the company dry in less than 6 months. I bought that equity to save the factory workers from your financial incompetence. I am not giving it back so you can maintain your country club memberships." Catherine stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating. "You do not have a choice, Cassidy. Jamal's articles were just the appetizer. If you do not sign this document right now, I am going on national television tomorrow morning. I have already spoken to producers at 2 major morning broadcast networks. They are incredibly eager to secure an exclusive interview with the grieving widow of a prominent industrialist." She paused, letting the threat hang in the air between us. She was not bluffing. She thrived on attention, and she knew exactly how to play to an audience. "I am going to sit on their comfortable studio couches." Catherine continued, her voice dripping with malice. "I am going to cry on high-definition cameras. I am going to tell millions of viewers how my youngest daughter, a ruthless Wall Street shark, took advantage of her father's severe cognitive decline. I will tell them how you manipulated an old, dying man into signing away the legacy meant for his grandchildren. I will completely destroy whatever is left of your miserable career." "You have no proof of coercion," I replied smoothly, refusing to show her an ounce of fear. "I have 3 independent medical evaluations proving his competence." "I do not need medical evaluations." My mother shot back, a cruel, triumphant smile twisting her features. "I have you. I have your personality. I have your entire history of being a cold, unfeeling robot. Do you know what people saw at the funeral yesterday, Cassidy? They saw a daughter who did not shed a single tear for her dead father. They saw a woman who stood in the corner, staring at her watch, acting like she was waiting for a business meeting to end. You did not cry. You did not mourn. You just handed over a credit card like you were paying for a business lunch." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "The media will eat you alive. When I tell them how cold you are, They will believe every single word. They will believe you are a clinical psychopath because that is exactly how you act. You have no empathy. You have no heart. Weaponizing your lack of emotion will be the easiest public relations campaign Jamal has ever orchestrated. Sign the papers, or I will make sure you are unemployable in the financial sector for the rest of your natural life. The silence that followed her threat was profound. She had aimed directly for the deepest, most painful insecurity of my childhood. For 33 years, she had made me feel defective because I processed the world through logic and numbers rather than loud, theatrical, emotional displays. She was using the very defense mechanism I had built to survive her toxic parenting as the ultimate weapon to destroy me. It was a profound, unforgivable betrayal. A mother explicitly promising to annihilate her own child to protect the daughter she preferred. I looked at Catherine Reynolds. I did not see a mother. I saw a hostile corporate entity attempting a fraudulent buyout through blackmail. I reached out and took the legal document from her hand. For a split second, a look of profound relief and victory washed over her face. She thought the psychological strike had worked. She thought she had broken me. I gripped the top of the thick paper and smoothly, deliberately tore it completely in half. Catherine gasped, stumbling backward, as if I had physically struck her. I tore the document again, reducing the 50% transfer agreement to useless shreds of paper, and let the pieces fall onto the carpeted floor of the corridor. "Go on television, Catherine," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm absolute zero. "Go on the morning shows, cry for the cameras, tell them I am a cold, calculating psychopath. Because a cold, calculating psychopath does not fold under emotional blackmail. When you go on national television, I will release the unredacted bank statements proving that you, Lauren, and Jamal embezzled $12 million from the family company. I will show the world the exact fraudulent vendor invoices you used to buy your designer clothes while the factory workers were facing layoffs." I stepped forward, forcing her to retreat toward the elevator doors. "You think my reputation is destroyed. My reputation on Wall Street is built on ruthless efficiency and mathematical truth. Your reputation in your wealthy suburban bubble is built entirely on lies, stolen money, and the illusion of perfection. If you declare war on me in the media, I will hand your financial records directly to the federal authorities. I will let the world watch you lose your mansion, your cars, and your freedom." I turned my back on her, keyed my security code into my front door, and pushed it open. I stepped inside my sanctuary and looked over my shoulder one last time at the woman who had just burned our final bridge to the ground. "Do not ever come to my home again," I commanded. I grabbed the heavy door and slammed it shut with a resounding, violent crack. The deadbolt clicked into place automatically, sealing her out of my life and sealing my resolve to finish this war on my own terms. I did not waste a single second lingering by the door or feeling sorry for myself. Emotion was a luxury I could not afford, and my mother had just proven that she was willing to burn our family to ash to protect her own vanity. I walked straight to my kitchen island, poured a glass of cold water, and picked up my smartphone. I dialed David Thorne. The phone rang exactly once before our chief financial officer answered. His voice was tight with anxiety. I told him Catherine had just attempted blackmail at my apartment and failed miserably. I warned him that Jamal was officially out of legal options. A man drowning in massive debt does not wait for a court date. He breaks windows. I ordered David to put the IT security team on maximum high alert. We needed to monitor every single ping, every login attempt, and every data request on the Reynolds Industries servers. I knew exactly how corporate scavengers operated when cornered. Across state lines inside his sprawling, heavily mortgaged suburban estate, Jamal Hayes was running out of time. His venture capital firm, Vanguard Horizon, was a hollow shell operating on fumes and fraudulent loan extensions. He sat in his opulent home office staring at a massive monitor displaying a string of margin calls and past due notices from aggressive private lenders. Catherine had called him 10 minutes ago, sobbing hysterically from the back seat of her town car, confessing that the blackmail attempt at my apartment had completely imploded. She told him I was prepared to hand their financial records over to the federal authorities. Jamal slammed his fist against his mahogany desk, rattling his expensive whiskey glass. The media smear campaign was supposed to force me into a swift surrender. Instead, it had backed him into a lethal corner. He knew a protracted legal battle over the company equity would trigger an immediate forensic audit. If anyone looked closely at his books, he was going to prison for a very long time. He needed an immediate massive influx of untraceable cash, and he needed to destroy my company's valuation so I would be left holding a worthless asset. Jamal paced the length of his office, his mind racing through illegal contingencies. He could not sell the Ohio plant. He could not access the corporate bank accounts. The physical assets were entirely locked down. But there was one asset Reynolds Industries possessed that was worth tens of millions of dollars on the black market: the proprietary client database. It contained 3 decades of confidential manufacturing schematics, global supply chain contracts, raw material pricing algorithms, and upcoming product patent filings. If a rival corporation got their hands on that data, they could undercut every single Reynolds contract and steal our entire global market share within a fiscal quarter. The company valuation would instantly plummet to zero, leaving my 90% stake completely worthless. Jamal walked out of his office and found Lauren sitting in the living room, frantically scrolling through social media comments about the scandal. He grabbed her by the arm and pulled her into the study, locking the door behind them. He demanded her corporate login credentials. Lauren blinked at him, confused, reminding him that I had fired her and deactivated her physical security badge. Jamal let out a harsh, demeaning laugh, explaining that physical security badges and digital server access were 2 entirely different systems. During her tenure as the heavily pampered vice president of brand strategy, Lauren had demanded top-tier administrative access to the corporate network. She claimed she needed it to align brand synergy across all technical departments. In reality, she just wanted the highest security clearance to feel important. The previous IT director, intimidated by my mother, had bypassed standard security protocols and granted Lauren unrestricted remote access to the primary servers. Jamal sat Lauren down at his desk and ordered her to log into the Reynolds Industries virtual private network. Lauren hesitated, her manicured hands trembling over the keyboard. She whined that they could get in serious trouble for hacking into a corporate mainframe. Jamal leaned over her shoulder, his voice turning dark and menacing. He reminded her that they were already facing federal prison time for the $12 million they had embezzled to fund their lavish lifestyle. Stealing the database was their only ticket out. He had already made contact with a ruthless executive at Meridian Industrial, our largest corporate competitor. Meridian was willing to pay $8 million in untraceable offshore cryptocurrency for the complete Reynolds database. That money would allow Jamal and Lauren to flee the country, pay off the most dangerous private lenders, and disappear before the FBI could freeze their passports. Driven by the sheer panic of impending poverty and prison, Lauren typed in her old username and the absurdly simple password she had used for 5 years. Jamal held his breath as the loading screen buffered. A few seconds later, the Reynolds Industries secure intranet dashboard illuminated the dark room. Jamal pushed Lauren out of the leather chair and took over the keyboard. He navigated past the useless marketing folders and went straight for the central nervous system of the company. He located the master directory containing the global client registry, the 10-year pricing algorithms, and the confidential supplier negotiations. "This is it," Jamal whispered, a triumphant, greedy smile spreading across his face. He clicked the download command, initiating a mass data transfer to an external encrypted hard drive he had plugged into the console. The progress bar popped up on the screen, calculating the time remaining for the massive file transfer. Jamal watched the percentage tick upward, calculating his escape route. He imagined the look of sheer devastation on my face when I realized my newly acquired manufacturing empire had been hollowed out from the inside. He thought he was executing the perfect digital heist. He thought he had outsmarted the cold, calculating Wall Street executive. He did not realize that I had spent my entire 33 years of life analyzing human weakness and my entire professional career anticipating corporate sabotage. He did not know that a competent network administrator never truly leaves a backdoor open by accident. As Jamal sat in his dark office eagerly watching the progress bar fill with stolen data, he was completely oblivious to the fact that his digital break-in was not a stealth operation. It was a brilliantly illuminated flare going up in the night sky. He was not downloading the future of his escape. He was downloading the final irrefutable pieces of evidence I needed to lock him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his life. I sat in my penthouse office, watching a specialized monitor provided by the corporate cybersecurity team David Thorne had engaged at my command. A digital map of the Reynolds Industries network glowed against the dark glass of my desk. On the secondary screen, David was patched in via a secure encrypted video conference line. He looked exhausted, rubbing his temples, but his eyes were glued to the live data feed. We were watching a pulsing red line representing an unauthorized data extraction originating from Lauren's old administrative account. Jamal had taken the bait perfectly. David leaned forward toward his webcam. He is pulling the entire global client registry, Cassidy. He is bypassing the marketing folders and heading straight for the master pricing algorithms and the overseas supplier contracts. If he successfully sells this to Meridian Industrial, it will cause catastrophic market damage. Should I have the IT department kill the server connection now? I shook my head, my eyes tracking the exact volume of data Jamal was currently siphoning. No, David. Let him take it. Let him take absolutely everything he thinks he needs. If we sever the connection now, his high-priced lawyers will argue it was a simple misunderstanding or a mistaken login attempt by a former employee trying to retrieve personal files. We need establishing intent. We need him to commit a full-scale, undeniable corporate espionage felony. I want the federal prosecutors to have a bow tied around this conviction. The cybersecurity contractor sitting across from me typed rapidly on his specialized terminal. He was not just watching the download. He was actively tracing the digital breadcrumbs Jamal was carelessly leaving behind. Because Jamal was using a rushed virtual private network connection, he assumed he was cloaked in anonymity. But corporate firewalls built to protect billions of dollars in manufacturing patents do not simply block intruders, they interrogate them. The security program was currently bouncing the signal back, peeling away Jamal's digital masks one by one. Got him, the contractor announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. He pushed a printed report across my desk. The unauthorized access is not coming from a random offshore server. It is a direct hit from a residential internet service provider located in the exact zip code of your mother's suburban estate. The hardware identification tag matches a high-end desktop computer previously registered to Jamal's venture capital firm. We are logging the exact timestamps, the specific file directories accessed, and the total volume of proprietary data stolen. It is an airtight digital fingerprint. I took the printed report and placed it directly into the heavy physical folder containing the IRS audited financial records. The trap was now fully operational and complete. Jamal was not just a corporate embezzler anymore. By attempting to sell our trade secrets to a rival manufacturer, he had crossed the line into federal wire fraud and violations of the Economic Espionage Act. I had him perfectly cornered. The financial ruin of his venture capital firm was the motive. The $12 million he and Lauren had previously stolen was the pattern of behavior. And this live server breach was the smoking gun. My smartphone buzzed violently against the glass surface of my desk, shattering the quiet concentration of the room. I glanced down at the screen. A new text message had arrived. The sender was Lauren. I picked up the device and opened the notification, expecting a frantic plea or a desperate manipulation tactic. Instead, I found a message dripping with venomous arrogance. "See you in court, you ugly dropout. You will be left with nothing." I stared at the glowing text message for a long moment. Lauren was truly living in a delusional alternate reality. She honestly believed that her media smear campaign had worked. She thought my suspension from the Wall Street firm meant I was broken, bleeding, and ready to surrender. She envisioned herself walking into a federal courthouse as the beautiful, victimized golden child, ready to watch the judge strip away my ownership of the company. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was actively committing a federal crime using her own login credentials at that very second. I did not reply to her message. Engaging in petty text message warfare was a tactic for amateurs. Instead, I took a screenshot of her gloating threat, printed it out, and added it to the master legal binder. Her text was the perfect demonstration of her unrepentant malice. It proved she had no intention of backing down, which meant I had absolutely no reason to show her an ounce of mercy when the hammer finally fell. David spoke up from the video feed, his voice sounding much more steady now that the digital theft was fully documented. The data transfer is complete, Cassidy. The unauthorized user has disconnected from the primary corporate server. He has the files. I closed the master legal binder with a solid, definitive snap. Excellent work, David. Now I want you to initiate a total system lockdown. Purge Lauren's old credentials completely and reboot the security protocols. Tomorrow morning, I want you to contact our external legal counsel and have them draft a formal notice of a data breach, but embargo the release until I give the explicit command. We are going to let Jamal walk into that courtroom tomorrow holding a stolen database he thinks is his golden ticket. We will let him and his lawyer present their entire fabricated case of elder abuse, and then we will lock the doors and show the judge exactly what they have been doing behind the scenes. I dismissed the cybersecurity contractor and ended the video call with David. The penthouse was silent again. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling, glittering expanse of New York City. The city was a battlefield of capital and leverage, a place where only the most calculated survived. My family had tried to play the game using suburban gossip and emotional blackmail. They had brought a knife to a drone strike. I poured myself a single glass of sparkling water, sipping it slowly as I reviewed my final checklist. The IRS documents were verified. The server breach was meticulously logged. The corporate ownership was legally untouchable. Everything was perfectly aligned for the preliminary injunction hearing tomorrow. Jamal and Lauren thought they were going to use the justice system to destroy me. They were about to discover that the justice system was the exact weapon I was going to use to permanently dismantle their entire fraudulent existence. I set the glass down and turned off the lights in my office, fully prepared for the absolute carnage of the morning. The morning sun reflected harshly off the towering glass and concrete facade of the federal courthouse in downtown Manhattan. The building was a monolith of absolute authority, the perfect arena for the corporate execution I had orchestrated. I stepped out of my black town car wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit, my briefcase gripped firmly in my right hand. I did not bring a large entourage. I only brought my lead defense attorney, an exceptionally sharp corporate litigator named Thomas, and my chief financial officer, David Thorne. David carried a single heavily reinforced cardboard box. It contained the certified financial records, the medical competency evaluations, and the digital logs of the server breach. We walked up the wide stone steps with the synchronized silent efficiency of a firing squad. A swarm of financial journalists and local reporters had gathered near the security checkpoint, tipped off by the aggressive public relations firm Jamal had hired. The flashing cameras and shouted questions were designed to rattle me. Reporters yelled accusations about elder abuse and corporate theft, quoting the exact headlines my brother-in-law had manufactured. I did not break my stride. I did not raise my hand to shield my face or offer a panicked no comment. I walked through the gauntlet of flashing lights with my head held high, my expression carved from marble. Showing distress to the press was an admission of vulnerability, and I was entirely invulnerable today. By contrast, the arrival of my family was a masterclass in theatrical victimhood. Jamal and Lauren arrived 10 minutes after me in a rented black sport utility vehicle. Lauren stepped out wearing a demure conservative gray dress that severely contradicted her usual flashy designer-heavy wardrobe. She wore minimal makeup and kept her head bowed, clinging tightly to Jamal's arm. Jamal wore a dark, understated suit projecting the image of a noble protective husband shielding his fragile wife from a monstrous corporate raider. My mother, Catherine, completed the illusion perfectly. She walked closely behind them, clutching a designer tissue to her eyes, playing the role of the devastated matriarch whose family had been torn apart by greed. They stopped for the cameras. Jamal placed a comforting hand on Lauren's back and gave a brief, sorrowful statement to the press about trusting the federal justice system to restore his late father-in-law's true legacy. It was a sickening performance, but it was highly effective. The media ate it up, capturing their tragic expressions for the midday news cycle. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The heavy wooden benches and high ceilings demanded reverence. I took my seat at the defense table next to Thomas. David Thorne sat directly behind us in the gallery, resting his hands protectively on top of the evidence box. Across the center aisle, the plaintiff's table was crowded. Jamal and Lauren sat next to their high-priced litigator, a notoriously aggressive attorney named Richard Kensington. Kensington was a man who specialized in high-profile corporate disputes, a shark who charged an exorbitant hourly rate to spin devastating narratives. Catherine sat in the very front row of the gallery, positioned perfectly within the line of sight of the judge's bench. She continued to dab her dry eyes with her tissue, making sure her performance of maternal heartbreak was front and center. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open and the bailiff announced the arrival of Judge Mitchell. He was a veteran of the federal bench, a man known for his sharp intellect and low tolerance for corporate manipulation. He took his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked down at the massive stack of preliminary injunction filings Jamal's team had submitted the previous day. "You may proceed," Counselor Judge Mitchell stated, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. Richard Kensington stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He did not walk to the podium. He stepped out into the center of the floor, commanding the space, addressing the judge with the polished gravitas of a seasoned storyteller. "Your Honor, we are here today to rectify a profound and unconscionable injustice." Kensington began, his voice echoing with righteous indignation. "We are asking this court to grant an immediate preliminary injunction to freeze the assets, bank accounts, and operational control of Reynolds Industries. We are asking you to strip the defendant Cassidy Reynolds of her fraudulently acquired majority shareholder status before she can completely liquidate her family's legacy." Kensington turned and pointed an accusing finger directly at me. "The defendant is a highly trained mergers and acquisitions specialist on Wall Street. She spends her life identifying vulnerabilities in complex corporate structures. 14 months ago, she identified a vulnerability within her own family. Her father, the founder of Reynolds Industries, was suffering from rapid, severe cognitive decline. He was a vulnerable, dying man who could no longer comprehend complex legal and financial documents." Lauren let out a soft, rehearsed sob at the plaintiff's table. Jamal wrapped an arm around her shoulders, comforting her. Judge Mitchell watched their reaction, his expression softening marginally before looking back at Kensington. Using her specialized financial knowledge, the defendant drafted a convoluted, highly irregular stock transfer agreement. Kensington continued, pacing slowly in front of the judge's bench. She bypassed the family's traditional legal counsel. She brought this dense, impenetrable document into a hospital room and coerced a confused elderly man into signing away 90% of a manufacturing empire. She stole the company right out from under her mother and her sister, securing her own fortune while her family was distracted by their profound grief. Kensington paused, letting the weight of the accusations sink into the silent courtroom. He walked back to his table and picked up a photograph. It was a picture taken at the funeral by one of the opportunistic reporters. It showed me standing by the burial site, looking completely dry-eyed and stoic. "Your Honor, the defendant's actions over the past week demonstrate a chilling lack of basic human empathy," Kensington argued, his voice rising in volume. "At her own father's funeral, she did not shed a single tear. Instead, she used the gathering to brazenly assert her financial dominance over her grieving mother. Less than 24 hours later, she used private security to violently eject her sister from the corporate headquarters. She is attempting a hostile takeover of a family business using forged consent. If this court does not grant the injunction today, she will dismantle the company, sell it off piece by piece, and leave her mother completely destitute. Kensington returned to his seat, sitting down with a heavy, dramatic sigh. The courtroom remained completely silent. The optics were utterly devastating. From the perspective of anyone who did not have access to the raw financial data, I looked exactly like the monster Jamal had paid the media to describe. I looked like a ruthless, unfeeling corporate machine who had cannibalized her own blood for profit. Judge Mitchell folded his hands together and looked down at me from the elevated bench. His eyes were narrowed, his expression etched with deep skepticism and visible distaste. He had clearly read the aggressive media reports over his morning coffee. He had watched my mother crying in the gallery. He had listened to Kensington's masterful character assassination. The entire room expected me to panic. They expected my lawyer to scramble to stand up and frantically object, to launch into a passionate, emotional defense of my character. I did not panic. I did not display a single ounce of fear or distress. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, my hands resting calmly on the table in front of me. I looked up at the judge, meeting his skeptical gaze with absolute, unblinking clarity. I was entirely comfortable letting Jamal and his high-priced lawyer build a massive, towering structure of lies. The taller the structure they built in this courtroom, the more spectacular the collapse was going to be. I glanced at the heavy cardboard box sitting on the bench behind me. It was time to stop listening to stories and start doing the math. Judge Mitchell turned his gaze away from Jamal's lawyer and looked directly at our table. The courtroom held its collective breath. "Mr. Thomas," the judge said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence, "the plaintiff has presented a highly disturbing narrative. Are you prepared to call your character witnesses to refute these allegations of elder abuse and coercion?" Thomas stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with meticulous precision. He did not walk out to the center of the floor to perform a theatrical monologue. He simply picked up the reinforced cardboard box resting on the bench behind us and placed it squarely on the defense table. The impact sounded like a gavel striking wood. "Your Honor, the defense will call absolutely zero character witnesses today," Thomas stated, his voice devoid of any dramatic flair. "We are not here to debate my client's personality, her emotional expressions at a funeral, or her relationship with her mother. We are here in a federal court of law, and the only metric that matters in this room is objective, mathematically verifiable truth." Thomas opened the box. He pulled out a massive stack of bound financial records. The top page of every single packet bore a distinct, undeniable red stamp. "We submit into evidence Defense Exhibit A. This is a comprehensive 5-year forensic audit of Reynolds Industries. These are not internal company spreadsheets. These documents have been directly reviewed, verified, and stamped by the Internal Revenue Service." A low murmur rippled through the gallery of reporters. Submitting documents audited by the Internal Revenue Service in a preliminary injunction hearing was the nuclear option. It meant we were not just defending a stock transfer. We were opening the entire corporate history to federal scrutiny. Richard Kensington, Jamal's high-priced lawyer, suddenly leaned forward in his chair. The arrogant swagger he had displayed during his opening statement vanished instantly. He leaned over and whispered something urgently to Jamal. Jamal swallowed hard. His eyes locked onto the red stamps visible from across the aisle. He knew exactly what those stamps meant. His media smear campaign was completely useless against federal tax authorities. Furthermore, Thomas continued, handing the massive stack of documents to the bailiff to pass to the judge. "We are not going to waste the court's time arguing about whether my client manipulated a vulnerable man. We are going to show you exactly why that 90% stock transfer was legally executed 14 months ago. To do that, the defense calls its first and only witness, Cassidy Reynolds." I stood up from my chair. I did not smooth my skirt or hesitate. I walked purposefully toward the witness stand. I did not cast a single glance at my mother, who was now clutching her tissue with genuine mounting anxiety. I ignored Lauren, who was staring at me with a mixture of hatred and confusion. I raised my right hand, swore the oath to tell the whole truth, and took my seat in the witness box. I adjusted the microphone in front of me. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Judge Mitchell was already flipping through the first few pages of the audit, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. "Miss Reynolds." Thomas began standing behind the defense table. "The plaintiff has accused you of executing a hostile, fraudulent takeover of a family business. They claim you stole a highly profitable manufacturing empire from your grieving relatives. Is that an accurate representation of the events that occurred 14 months ago?" "No, it is not," I replied, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the room. "It is a fundamental misrepresentation of both corporate law and basic accounting. Can you explain to the court the actual financial status of Reynolds Industries at the time the stock transfer was executed?" Thomas asked. I looked directly at Judge Mitchell. I did not speak to Jamal, and I did not speak to the reporters in the gallery. I spoke to the only person in the room who had the power to rule on the facts. 14 months ago, Reynolds Industries was not a highly profitable manufacturing empire, I stated, delivering the first fatal blow to their narrative. It was a functionally bankrupt entity, standing exactly 3 weeks away from total asset liquidation. The company was carrying $12 million in toxic, unserviceable debt. The primary lenders had already drafted foreclosure notices. They were preparing to seize the Ohio manufacturing plant, shut down operations, lay off 300 factory workers, and confiscate my mother's suburban estate, which had been illegally leveraged as collateral. Lauren gasped audibly from the plaintiff's table. My mother dropped her tissue on the floor. "Objection!" Kensington shouted, jumping to his feet, his face flushed. "This is entirely speculative and irrelevant to the matter of the stock transfer." "It is the exact opposite of speculative, Your Honor," Thomas countered smoothly. "If you look at page 4 of the audit in front of you, you will see the exact foreclosure notices and the $12 million deficit my client is referencing. The defense is establishing the precise motive for the equity transfer." Judge Mitchell looked at the document, then looked over his glasses at Kensington. "The objection is overruled. The witness will continue, and Counselor, I strongly suggest you let her finish." Kensington slowly sat back down. Jamal was staring at the table, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Miss Reynolds," Thomas prompted. "If the company was bankrupt, why did you acquire 90% of the controlling equity?" "Because someone had to pay the bills," I answered, my tone razor sharp. "I am a mergers and acquisitions specialist. My job is to identify distressed assets and structure bailouts. My father came to me in secret 14 months ago because he had discovered the massive deficit. He was terrified for his employees and his legacy. He did not give me the company as a gift. He did not sign those papers because he was confused. He signed them because I was the only person willing and able to buy the toxic debt." I leaned forward slightly, looking right at Jamal. "I did not steal Reynolds Industries. I bought it. I liquidated my entire personal stock portfolio on Wall Street. I leveraged my own penthouse and my professional reputation to secure a $12 million bridge loan. I paid off the creditors in full. In corporate finance, equity is exchanged for capital," I explained to the judge, turning the courtroom into my personal boardroom. "When an entity assumes $12 million in liabilities from a failing enterprise, the standard structural requirement is absolute operational control. That is not elder abuse. That is a standard corporate bailout. If I had not executed that transfer, the plaintiffs sitting across this aisle would not be fighting over a company today. They would be filing for personal bankruptcy. The 90% equity stake was the mathematical cost of saving my family from living on the street." The absolute silence in the federal courtroom was deafening. I had just laid out the brutal mathematical reality of my family's financial survival, and the impact hit the room like a physical shockwave. Judge Mitchell stared at me, his previously skeptical expression completely erased, replaced by the sharp, focused intensity of a jurist who suddenly realizes he is looking at a massive crime scene. He slowly turned his attention back to the heavy stack of documents on his desk, his fingers tracing the red stamps from the Internal Revenue Service. My lawyer, Thomas, stepped out from behind the defense table. "Miss Reynolds," he said, his voice echoing clearly across the polished wood floor. "You testified that the company was carrying $12 million in toxic, unserviceable debt. As an expert in corporate acquisitions, did you identify the source of that massive deficit? Was Reynolds Industries simply a victim of poor market conditions or overseas manufacturing competition?" I shook my head, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. "No, Thomas. The market conditions for our manufacturing sector were highly favorable during that fiscal period. The company was generating record-breaking gross revenue. The $12 million deficit was not caused by external economic forces. It was caused by a systematic internal financial hemorrhage." I turned my gaze toward the plaintiff table. Lauren was gripping her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Jamal was staring straight ahead, his jaw locked, entirely unable to look me in the eye. I direct the court's attention to Section 4, page 82 of the forensic audit, I stated, addressing the judge directly. "You will find a detailed ledger of accounts payable originating from the Office of the Vice President of Brand Strategy. Over a period of 24 months, that office authorized the creation of 7 distinct vendor accounts. These vendors were listed as overseas marketing consultants and digital supply chain optimizers. However, when my team audited the corporate registry, we discovered that these vendors provided absolutely zero tangible goods or services to Reynolds Industries." Judge Mitchell flipped rapidly through the thick binder, locating the exact page I referenced. He ran his index finger down the columns of numbers. "Are you stating these were shell companies, Miss Reynolds?" he asked, his tone gravely serious. "I am stating that as a verified fact." "Your Honor," I replied, "the corporate entities registered under names like Crestview Holdings and Zenith Supply Solutions were nothing more than empty digital mailboxes. The audit proves that the Vice President of Brand Strategy authorized over 400 separate invoices to these shell companies. The funds were wired out of the primary corporate operating account, funneled through 2 offshore holding accounts, and then deposited directly into the personal banking portfolios of Lauren Hayes and her husband Jamal Hayes." A loud gasp erupted from the gallery of financial journalists. The reporters were frantically typing on their phones and tablets, capturing the explosive revelation. Richard Kensington, Jamal's high-priced lawyer, sat completely frozen in his chair. He had walked into this courtroom prepared to argue a civil dispute over a family will. He had just realized his clients had concealed a massive, coordinated federal embezzlement scheme from him. Thomas walked closer to the witness stand. "And where exactly did that stolen $12 million go, Miss Reynolds?" I looked right at my mother, who was sitting in the front row, her face drained of all color. The illusion of her perfect suburban life was crumbling right in front of her eyes. The forensic tracing in Section 5 of the audit breaks down the exact expenditure of the stolen capital, I explained smoothly. $3.5 million was used to purchase a luxury estate in the Hamptons under Lauren's name. Another $2 million funded a fleet of imported luxury vehicles and private European vacations. But the vast majority of the embezzled funds, exactly $6.5 million, was injected directly as emergency cash into Vanguard Horizon. That is the venture capital firm wholly owned and operated by Jamal Hayes. He was using stolen manufacturing payroll funds to artificially inflate his own failing investment portfolio. Jamal suddenly shot up from his chair. "This is a complete fabrication," he yelled, his voice cracking with pure panic. "She manufactured those ledgers to frame us. Sit down immediately!" "Mr. Hayes," Judge Mitchell roared, slamming his gavel down so hard the sound cracked like a whip. "If you speak out of turn again in my courtroom, you will spend the night in federal holding." Jamal slowly sank back into his chair, his face slick with sweat. His own lawyer leaned away from him, visibly creating physical distance from a client who had just become a massive legal liability. Thomas waited for the room to completely settle before asking his final devastating question. "Miss Reynolds, how did your father discover this $12 million deficit?" I took a slow, measured breath. This was the moment that truly mattered. This was the truth that had been buried under my family's mountain of lies. 14 months ago, David Thorne, our chief financial officer, noticed an alarming discrepancy. In the quarterly reconciliation reports, I stated, my voice softening just a fraction to convey the genuine tragedy of the situation. He brought the anomalies directly to my father. My father demanded the raw data from the banking institutions. When he sat at his desk and traced the shell companies back to his oldest daughter and his son-in-law, he realized they had completely bankrupted the company he spent 30 years building. They had stolen his employees' pension funds to buy sports cars and fund a fraudulent venture capital firm. The courtroom was dead silent. The reporters stopped typing. My father did not suffer a random age-related medical emergency. I continued, my eyes locked on Lauren, forcing her to hear the reality of her actions. He discovered that his golden child had systematically robbed him blind and destroyed his legacy. The sheer psychological shock and profound stress of that betrayal triggered a massive stroke right there in his office. He collapsed with the forged invoices still clutched in his hand. He was rushed to the hospital and he never regained his full cognitive and physical mobility. I leaned back in the witness chair, delivering the final crushing blow. He did not sign the company over to me because he was suffering from dementia. He signed it over to me from his hospital bed because he was desperately trying to save his innocent employees from the absolute destruction his eldest daughter had caused. I stepped in, paid the debt, and took the equity because Lauren and Jamal had already stripped the bones bare. They turned a thriving, profitable enterprise into a graveyard, and then they had the absolute audacity to call me the vulture. The echo of my final word hung in the sterile air of the federal courtroom. I watched the blood drain from Lauren's face. She sank back into her chair as if the oxygen had been pulled from her lungs. Jamal stared at his hands, completely paralyzed. The media gallery behind them erupted into a frenzy of furious typing and hushed whispers. They had come to report on a greedy corporate raider. Instead, they were witnessing the real-time destruction of a criminal conspiracy. Judge Mitchell did not bang his gavel. He was too focused on the forensic audit in front of him. He turned the page, tracing the financial lineage of the $12 million debt. He looked up at me, his eyes sharp and engaged. "Miss Reynolds," the judge said, his voice projecting clearly, "you stated that you stepped in and paid the debt. $12 million is an astronomical sum of personal capital to liquidize on short notice. I need you to clarify the exact mechanics of this transaction for the court record. Did you simply pay off the creditors on behalf of your father?" I shifted my gaze from my sister to the judge, maintaining absolute composure. "No, Your Honor," I replied smoothly. Paying off the debt on his behalf would have left the corporate structure vulnerable to further embezzlement by the plaintiffs. I did not pay off the creditors. I bought the debt. I contacted the primary lending institutions holding the defaulted notes and negotiated a direct purchase of the toxic liabilities. In the eyes of the law, I did not just save Reynolds Industries. I became the bank. My defense attorney, Thomas, stepped forward to guide the testimony. "How exactly did you finance the purchase of $12 million in toxic corporate debt, Miss Reynolds?" I kept my voice perfectly level. "I am a senior partner at a prominent Wall Street mergers and acquisitions firm. Over the past 10 years, I have lived well below my means, investing every single performance bonus into a highly aggressive portfolio. When my father came to me terrified and broken, I had exactly 48 hours before the banks initiated the foreclosure protocols. I executed a total liquidation of my entire stock portfolio. I emptied my retirement accounts. I leveraged my Manhattan penthouse to secure a massive commercial bridge loan. I put every single asset I have ever earned on the line to generate $12 million in liquid cash." Thomas walked slowly toward the center aisle, capturing the full attention of the silent room. "You risked your entire financial future to save a company that your sister and brother-in-law deliberately destroyed. Why? Was it solely to save the jobs of the 300 factory workers you mentioned earlier?" The factory workers were my father's primary concern, I stated clearly. But they were not the only casualties of Jamal and Lauren's greed. I turned my head and looked directly at my mother, Catherine. She was sitting in the front row of the gallery, shaking visibly. Her hands were gripping the wooden railing separating the gallery from the courtroom floor. I addressed the judge again, but I made sure my mother heard every syllable. When the plaintiffs created their fraudulent shell companies and began siphoning millions of dollars out of the operating accounts they needed to cover the massive cash flow shortages. To do that, they took out massive high-interest commercial loans that carried aggressively rigid repayment terms. But the company's credit was already ruined. They needed physical collateral. So Lauren forged my father's signature and leveraged my mother's sprawling suburban estate. My mother gasped a raw, ugly sound that echoed through the quiet courtroom. She looked at Lauren, her eyes wide with absolute horror. Lauren refused to look back at her. "That is correct, Your Honor." I continued, my voice unwavering. The massive estate my mother prizes above all else, the home where she hosted the funeral just a few days ago, was collateralized. If I had not stepped in and bought that $12 million debt with my own cash, the banks were not just going to board up the manufacturing plant. They were going to seize my mother's house. The foreclosure notices were already printed. My mother would have been thrown out onto the street completely destitute with absolutely nowhere to go. I did not steal her legacy. I am the only reason she did not wake up homeless a year ago. Judge Mitchell took a slow, heavy breath, leaning back in his tall leather chair. He looked at the plaintiff's table with a level of disgust that was palpable. And where were the plaintiffs, Jamal and Lauren Hayes, when you were liquidating your life savings to prevent the foreclosure of their mother's home? I allowed a cold, razor-sharp smile to touch the corners of my mouth. I looked right at Jamal, who was visibly trembling. According to their social media accounts and the travel itineraries we subpoenaed, they were on a 2-week all-expenses-paid luxury vacation in Dubai. The gallery erupted into shocked murmurs that echoed loudly. I raised my voice slightly to cut through the noise, driving the final nail into their coffin. While my father was lying in a hospital bed recovering from a stroke caused by their theft, and while I was emptying my bank accounts to save our mother from eviction, Lauren and Jamal were drinking champagne on a private yacht in the United Arab Emirates. They funded that vacation using the exact same stolen corporate funds that triggered the foreclosure crisis in the first place. Thomas walked back to the defense table, his job essentially complete. I rested my hands on the wooden railing of the witness box, concluding my testimony with absolute authority. That 90% equity share was not a gift from a dying man with dementia. It was not a manipulation. It was the legal, mathematical collateral I required in exchange for assuming $12 million in toxic liabilities. I bought the company free and clear, and I have the federal tax receipts to prove it. I sat back in the witness chair, smoothing my suit. The trap had been sprung. The illusion was completely shattered. Jamal and Lauren had dragged me into federal court, hoping to destroy my reputation and steal back the company they had bankrupted. Instead, they had forced me to place their entire history of fraud, embezzlement, and breathtaking familial betrayal onto the permanent federal record. They thought they were the predators, but they had just locked themselves inside the cage. The courtroom remained in a state of suspended animation following my revelation about the $12 million bailout. Judge Mitchell slowly closed the massive financial audit binder, the loud thud echoing like a slamming cell door. He looked at Jamal and Lauren, no longer seeing grieving family members, but verified corporate fraudsters. The preliminary injunction they had filed was effectively dead on arrival. But I was not just here to win a civil dispute. I was here to ensure they could never rebuild their parasitic lives on my dime ever again. I glanced at Thomas, giving him the imperceptible nod we had agreed upon. It was time to drop the final inescapable net. Thomas walked back to the defense table and retrieved a slim manila folder. It looked unassuming compared to the massive IRS audit, but the papers inside were infinitely more lethal. He approached the bench, handing one copy to the judge and placing the second copy directly in front of Richard Kensington. Your Honor. Thomas said, his voice dropping to a grave register. The defense has established that the plaintiffs have no legal standing to freeze the assets of Reynolds Industries. However, we must urgently bring an additional matter to the court's immediate attention. The plaintiffs did not merely file a frivolous civil injunction to harass my client. They used this pending litigation as a smokescreen to commit active corporate espionage. Judge Mitchell opened the manila folder. Jamal bolted upright in his chair, the legs screeching harshly against the polished floor. Kensington grabbed Jamal by the arm, forcing him back down, but Kensington's own eyes were darting frantically across the document Thomas had just handed him. Miss Reynolds. Thomas prompted, turning back to the witness stand. Can you identify the contents of Defense Exhibit B? I looked at the digital logs printed on the stark white paper. Those are certified cybersecurity tracking logs, I answered smoothly. Exactly 4 days ago, while I was being placed on administrative leave due to the plaintiff's fabricated media campaign, our corporate servers detected a massive unauthorized data extraction. Someone logged into the Reynolds Industries primary intranet using an outdated administrative credential previously assigned to Lauren Hayes. Lauren let out a sharp, panicked gasp. She looked at Jamal, sheer terror radiating from her widened eyes. Jamal was frozen, his chest heaving as the reality of his digital hubris crashed down upon him. He thought he had executed a stealth operation, oblivious to the fact that I had engineered the entire surveillance trap. What exactly was extracted from your servers? Judge Mitchell asked, his voice laced with dangerous authority. I maintained my perfectly calm, analytical cadence. The unauthorized user bypassed standard marketing files and targeted our highly confidential global client registry, our proprietary pricing algorithms, and our overseas supplier contracts. It is the exact intellectual property required to completely undercut our market share. If sold to a competitor, it would immediately render my 90% equity stake entirely worthless. Thomas stepped closer to the judge. Your Honor, the logs indicate the intruder used a virtual private network to mask their location. However, our security contractors utilized advanced counter-surveillance protocols to trace the signal back to its true origin. The data was downloaded directly to an Internet Protocol address registered to the suburban estate currently occupied by Catherine Reynolds. Furthermore, the hardware identification tag perfectly matches a primary desktop computer registered to Vanguard Horizon, the venture capital firm wholly owned by Jamal Hayes. The color completely drained from Richard Kensington's face. The high-priced, aggressive corporate litigator suddenly looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a live landmine. He stared at the cybersecurity logs, his razor-sharp legal mind calculating the catastrophic implications. His clients had not just lied to him about the embezzlement. They had actively used his services to tie up their sister in federal court while they committed a massive felony theft behind her back. Submitting false injunctions to cover up active economic espionage was a fast track to disbarment and federal prosecution. Kensington abruptly stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He did not look at Jamal. He did not look at Lauren. He looked directly at Judge Mitchell, his hands shaking slightly as he grabbed his expensive leather briefcase. Your Honor, Kensington said, his voice completely devoid of its former theatrical confidence. In light of the evidence just presented to this court, I find myself in an ethically untenable position. As an officer of the court, I cannot in good conscience continue to represent these individuals. I must formally and immediately request permission to withdraw as counsel for the plaintiffs Jamal and Lauren Hayes. The gallery erupted. Reporters scrambled over each other, whispering furiously into their recording devices and typing frantically on their laptops. A lawyer withdrawing on the spot in the middle of a federal hearing was the ultimate admission of guilt. It meant the evidence was so toxic, so undeniably criminal, that the attorney had to sever ties to avoid being implicated as a co-conspirator. Jamal grabbed Kensington's sleeve, genuine panic twisting his features. "You cannot do this," Jamal hissed loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "We paid you a massive retainer. You have to defend us." Kensington yanked his arm away, as if Jamal were physically contagious. "You paid me to litigate a civil dispute." Kensington shot back, his professional restraint entirely gone. "You did not pay me to facilitate federal wire fraud and corporate espionage. You are entirely on your own." Judge Mitchell struck his gavel, demanding order in the chaotic courtroom. The sharp, commanding sound cut through the frantic whispers of the press gallery. "The request to withdraw as counsel is granted, Mr. Kensington," the judge announced coldly. "You are excused from these proceedings." I sat in the witness box watching Kensington briskly pack his documents and march out of the courtroom without a single backward glance. Lauren buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her total destruction finally registered. My mother sat paralyzed in the front row, staring at the empty chair where their high-powered lawyer had just been sitting. They were completely defenseless, stripped of their legal armor, and exposed to the brutal, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. The checkmate was absolute, and I had not even raised my voice. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Richard Kensington, sealing the fate of the three people left sitting at the plaintiff table. The silence that followed his abrupt departure was absolute and suffocating. Judge Mitchell took a slow, deep breath, his eyes fixed on the empty chair where a high-priced corporate litigator had been sitting just seconds prior. He then turned his piercing gaze toward Jamal and Lauren. They looked like two incredibly small, terrified children who had just been caught playing with matches inside a burning building. In my 25 years on the federal bench, Judge Mitchell began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. "I have presided over complex corporate disputes, hostile takeovers, and bitter family litigations. But rarely have I witnessed such a brazen, calculated abuse of the judicial system. You did not come to this court seeking justice. You came to this court seeking a federally mandated smokescreen for active corporate espionage and wire fraud." Jamal opened his mouth, raising a trembling hand as if he were a student asking permission to speak. "Your Honor, please. There is a massive misunderstanding here. My lawyer abandoned us without reviewing the full scope of the digital access logs. I am authorized to explain the data transfers. Do not speak another word in my courtroom." "Mr. Hayes," Judge Mitchell roared, striking his gavel with a force that made my mother physically jump in her front row seat. "You have no legal representation. You have no credible defense. And based on the verified cybersecurity logs sitting on my desk, you have absolutely no respect for the law. You utilized a forged legal narrative to manipulate the media, harass a legitimate majority shareholder, and attempt the theft of proprietary trade secrets." Lauren buried her face in her hands, her shoulders heaving with loud, uncontrollable sobs. The pristine, victimized image she had carefully cultivated for the press outside the courthouse was entirely shattered. She was weeping not out of remorse but out of the sheer, terrifying realization that her actions finally had permanent, inescapable consequences. Judge Mitchell picked up the preliminary injunction filing they had submitted the previous day. He held it up for the entire room to see, then dropped it unceremoniously into the trash can beside his desk. "The motion for a preliminary injunction is denied," the judge declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Furthermore, this case is dismissed with prejudice. You are permanently barred from refiling this claim in any jurisdiction. I am also ordering a full transcript of today's proceedings, along with Defense Exhibits A and B, to be immediately forwarded to the United States Attorney Office for review." Jamal stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He grabbed Lauren by the arm, roughly pulling her to her feet. "We are leaving!" Jamal hissed, his eyes darting frantically toward the gallery exit. He looked at my mother, who was sitting paralyzed in the front row. "Catherine, get up. We are leaving right now." My mother tried to stand her legs, visibly shaking, her face completely drained of color. They thought they could simply walk out. They thought they could retreat to their suburban mansion, hire a new team of aggressive defense attorneys, and spend the next 3 years fighting a war of attrition in the courts while hiding behind their stolen wealth. They severely underestimated my strategic timeline. Before Jamal could take 3 steps down the center aisle, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sudden movement drew the eyes of every single reporter in the gallery. Two individuals stepped through the doorway. They did not look like journalists, and they certainly did not look like courtroom staff. They were dressed in stark, immaculate dark suits. They moved with a synchronized predatory efficiency that instantly commanded the space. As they walked down the center aisle, the fluorescent lights caught the metallic glint of the federal badges clipped securely to their belts. I remained perfectly still at the defense table, watching the final phase of my master plan unfold exactly as engineered. I had not ordered my team to compile that massive 5-year forensic audit solely to win a preliminary injunction hearing. You do not spend hundreds of hours verifying $12 million of embezzlement and tracking offshore cryptocurrency transfers just to impress a civil judge. I had submitted that entire physical box of evidence to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation 3 weeks ago. I had handed them the shell company routing numbers, the fake vendor invoices, and the exact digital signatures tying Lauren and Jamal to the stolen manufacturing payroll. The agents had been waiting quietly in the corridor outside the courtroom monitoring the proceedings. They were waiting for Jamal and Lauren to officially place themselves on the federal record, effectively trapping themselves in a perjury snare before the trap was sprung. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern, unyielding expression, stopped directly in front of Jamal. Jamal froze, his eyes widening in pure primal terror as he stared at the federal badge. Jamal Hayes and Lauren Hayes, the agent stated, his voice carrying the absolute uncompromising weight of the United States government. You are both under arrest. On what charges? Jamal stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate squeak. You cannot do this. We have not even been indicted. This is a civil dispute. The second agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and violations of the Economic Espionage Act. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Lauren let out a blood-curdling scream. She ripped her arm away from Jamal and stumbled backward, crashing into the wooden railing separating the gallery from the floor. Mom, Lauren shrieked, tears and mascara streaming down her face. Mom, do something. Tell them they cannot take me. I did not do anything. It was all Jamal. He made me sign those papers. Jamal spun around, his face contorted with absolute rage, completely throwing his wife to the wolves the second his own freedom was threatened. Do not listen to her, Jamal yelled at the agents as they forcefully grabbed his wrists and locked the steel cuffs into place. She was the vice president. She authorized the transfers. It was her family company. I am just a consultant. The perfect affluent partnership they had paraded in front of the cameras an hour ago dissolved into a vicious, ugly display of mutual betrayal. They were turning on each other right in front of the judge, the press, and my mother. The agents read them their rights, their voices cutting through Lauren's hysterical sobbing and Jamal's desperate, frantic shouting. I sat at the defense table and watched the steel bracelets lock around my sister's wrists. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the absolute, undeniable mathematics of karma balance the scales. They had tried to steal an empire, and now they were leaving the building in federal custody. The gallery of financial journalists went into an absolute frenzy. Camera shutters clicked wildly from the hallway as the reporters shoved each other to get a clear view of the high society couple being marched out of the federal court. This was no longer just a story about a family dispute over a manufacturing company. It was the white-collar criminal takedown of the decade, and I had handed it to the press on a silver platter. The frenzy in the gallery escalated into a chaotic symphony of overlapping voices and rapid camera flashes. Jamal Hayes, the man who had built his entire public persona on the illusion of untouchable corporate power, was currently fighting against the cold steel of federal handcuffs. He twisted his shoulders, attempting to pull his arms away from the towering FBI agent, a futile and pathetic display of resistance that only tightened the restraints around his wrists. His bespoke navy blue suit jacket bunched awkwardly around his neck. The expensive fabric he used to project dominance was now a rumpled mess, completely stripped of its authority. I am not going down for her financial illiteracy, Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, panicked desperation. His eyes darted wildly around the courtroom, seeking a lifeline that simply did not exist. He turned his head toward the judge, who was already gathering his files, entirely indifferent to the spectacle. You have to look at the internal emails, Your Honor. I was just advising the brand strategy department. Lauren was the one moving the capital. She was the one forging her father's authorization codes. I am a victim of her family's toxic corporate culture. Lauren stopped screaming long enough to process the magnitude of her husband's betrayal. She stared at Jamal with an expression of profound, unadulterated horror. The man she had paraded around the country club, the man she had proudly presented as a financial visionary, was loudly and publicly sacrificing her to the federal authorities to save his own skin. The perfect, loving partnership they had weaponized against me for years dissolved into toxic sludge right on the courtroom floor. "You coward, Lauren!" shrieked her voice echoing off the high ceiling. Her meticulously styled hair clung to her wet, tear-streaked cheeks. "You told me the shell companies were a standard tax shelter. You set up the offshore accounts. You said my father would never notice the missing revenue because he was losing his mind. I did everything you told me to do." The federal agents did not care about their domestic dispute. They possessed the electronic communication logs proving both of them were equally guilty of coordinating the embezzlement. The lead agent gave Jamal a sharp, forceful push toward the center aisle, completely ignoring his frantic attempts to negotiate a plea deal on the spot. "Walk." The agent commanded his tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate. Lauren stumbled backward as the second agent secured her wrists. The heavy metal cuffs looked massive against her delicate frame. She looked down at her restrained hands, unable to comprehend that her status as the golden child of a wealthy suburban family offered zero protection against federal felony charges. Panic consumed her entirely. She turned her tear-filled eyes toward the front row of the gallery, seeking the one person who had always shielded her from the consequences of her own actions. Mom, Lauren wailed, her voice thick with hysterical desperation. "Mom, do not let them do this to me. Call our lawyer. Call the bank. You have to post my bail right now. I cannot go to a federal holding cell. They will ruin my life. Please, Mom, tell them it is a mistake." My mother, Catherine Reynolds, remained completely paralyzed in the front row of the wooden gallery benches. She looked like a woman who had just watched a commercial airplane crash directly into her living room. Her hands gripped the wooden railing in front of her so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. The designer tissue she had used to fake her grief earlier lay discarded on the floor near her expensive shoes. For 36 years, Catherine had dedicated her entire existence to cultivating the illusion of a flawless high society family. She had enabled Lauren's worst impulses, rewarding her vanity and actively participating in the cruel marginalization of my character. Now the absolute foundation of her vanity was being marched down the aisle in federal restraints. Catherine slowly stood up, her legs visibly shaking under the weight of her sudden catastrophic reality. She looked at Lauren, but she did not see the successful brand executive she had bragged about to her wealthy friends. She saw a convicted felon who had secretly drained her retirement funds and illegally leveraged her beloved suburban estate. Catherine's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She had no money to post bail. She had no powerful connections who could intervene in an economic espionage case. The only person in the room who possessed the capital to save her was the daughter she had just spent the last hour trying to destroy on the public record. "Do not just stand there!" Lauren screamed at our mother, her voice growing increasingly ragged as the agent guided her firmly up the center aisle. "You promised you would fix this. You promised we were going to get the company back." Jamal tripped over his own expensive leather shoes as the agent pushed him forward. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes locking onto mine at the defense table. The arrogance that had defined his entire personality was completely extinguished. In its place was a hollow, haunting emptiness. He realized with absolute certainty that I had not just defeated his legal injunction. I had systematically gathered his digital fingerprints, mapped his offshore banking routes, and handed his entire fraudulent life to the Department of Justice on a silver platter. He opened his mouth to hurl one final insult, but the agent shoved him forward before he could articulate a single word. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, revealing the massive swarm of financial journalists and local news cameras waiting in the corridor. The sudden burst of camera flashes illuminated the hallway like a strobe light. The reporters shouted a cacophony of aggressive questions, demanding statements about the wire fraud charges, the elder abuse allegations, and the stolen $12 million. Lauren shrank away from the blinding camera flashes, bowing her head and sobbing uncontrollably as the agents marched them directly into the media feeding frenzy. Jamal tried to turn his face away from the lenses, but the sheer volume of reporters made escape impossible. Their humiliation was broadcast in real time to every major financial news network in the country. The pristine, highly curated facade of the suburban power couple was completely pulverized, replaced by the grim, inescapable reality of a federal perp walk. I remained seated at the defense table, watching the heavy oak doors slowly swing shut behind them, cutting off the chaotic noise of the press gallery. I did not feel an overwhelming surge of joy. I did not feel the need to stand up and celebrate a victory. I felt a cold, satisfying equilibrium. The mathematical equation of my family's betrayal had finally been solved. They had stolen $12 million from my father, and I had returned the exact value of their theft in federal prison sentences. David Thorne, my loyal chief financial officer, let out a long, shaky breath from the bench behind me. He looked at the empty plaintiff table, then looked back at me, his eyes wide with profound respect and a healthy dose of fear. I reached out and closed the heavy cardboard box containing the forensic audit. The corporate execution was successfully completed. I stood up from the defense table, methodically buttoning my navy blue suit jacket. Thomas snapped his briefcase shut with a sharp metallic click that echoed in the rapidly emptying courtroom. David Thorne lifted the heavy cardboard box containing the forensic audit, holding it against his chest like a shield. Words were entirely unnecessary. We walked up the center aisle with the synchronized precision of a surgical team, leaving a successfully completed operation. The heavy oak doors swung open, revealing the polished marble corridor of the federal courthouse. The swarm of financial journalists and news cameras had already chased Jamal and Lauren down toward the primary elevators, eager to capture every humiliating second of their perp walk. Their desperate screams for privacy echoed faintly down the hall, a pathetic soundtrack to their ultimate demise. The hallway was largely deserted, save for a few straggling court clerks and one completely shattered woman. My mother, Catherine Reynolds, was leaning heavily against the cold marble wall near the entrance. She looked absolutely unrecognizable. The perfectly curated facade of the affluent suburban matriarch had been violently stripped away, leaving behind a terrified, hyperventilating woman who had just watched her entire constructed reality collapse into dust. Her expensive designer coat hung awkwardly on her shaking shoulders, and her hands were trembling so violently she could barely clutch her leather handbag. As I approached her, Catherine's eyes darted wildly toward me. For the very first time in my 33 years of existence, she did not look at me with condescension, disappointment, or calculated manipulation. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated desperation. The complex, undeniable mathematics of the IRS forensic audit had finally pierced through her lifelong delusion. She was not a financial expert, but she understood the brutal reality of a foreclosure notice. She had sat in the front row and listened to the federal judge confirm that her beloved golden child, the daughter she had endlessly praised and protected, had secretly mortgaged her sprawling suburban estate to fund a fraudulent venture capital firm. Lauren had literally stolen her mother's retirement, her social status, and her home. Catherine finally realized that the scapegoat she had relentlessly despised was the sole reason she was not currently sleeping on a park bench. I had quietly absorbed the toxic $12 million debt, shielding her from the absolute devastation of homelessness, while the daughter she worshipped had been drinking champagne in Dubai on stolen payroll funds. The profound cognitive dissonance was actively short-circuiting her brain, stripping away decades of arrogant entitlement. Her breathing was shallow and erratic, a full-blown panic attack manifesting right in the middle of the federal courthouse corridor. I did not alter my pace. I intended to walk straight past her and out the front doors of the building without offering a single word of comfort. But as I drew level with her, Catherine lunged forward. She dropped her expensive handbag onto the marble floor and grabbed my right arm with both of her trembling hands. Her grip was astonishingly tight, her manicured nails digging into the fine wool of my suit sleeve. "Cassidy, please," Catherine gasped, her voice cracking into a raw, ugly sob. Genuine tears, thick and heavy, streamed down her face, ruining her meticulously applied makeup. "Please, you have to do something to stop this. You have to fix this. They are taking her to a federal holding cell. She will not survive in a place like that. You have the money. You have the entire company now. You can hire the best defense lawyers in New York to fight the prosecutors. You have to pay their bail immediately. You have to drop these charges right now. They are your family." Her plea was a fascinating study in psychological denial. Even after witnessing the incontrovertible proof of their staggering betrayal, she was still instinctively prioritizing Lauren's comfort over my boundaries. She still viewed me not as a daughter, but as a limitless financial utility, an emergency failsafe designed to catch Lauren whenever she inevitably plummeted toward disaster. I looked down at her hands gripping my arm. I did not yank my arm away in anger. I simply placed my left hand over hers and smoothly, firmly detached her fingers from my suit jacket. I took a deliberate step backward, establishing a rigid physical and emotional boundary that she would never cross again. I looked directly into her terrified, tear-filled eyes, ensuring my voice was as cold and unyielding as the marble floor beneath our feet. "I cannot drop the charges even if I wanted to, Mom," I stated, enunciating every single syllable with absolute clarity. "This is not a civil dispute over a broken contract. Wire fraud and economic espionage are federal crimes. The United States Department of Justice is pressing those charges, not me." Lauren and Jamal stole $12 million across state lines and attempted to sell proprietary trade secrets to corporate rivals. They are completely out of my hands, and they are entirely out of yours. Catherine let out a devastated whimper, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She finally understood that her golden child was beyond saving. I picked up her handbag and held it out to her. She took it mechanically, her eyes vacant and haunted. "And as for your demand that I pay their bail," I continued, delivering the final definitive stroke of my corporate execution. "I want you to remember the invoice you threw at me 2 hours after we buried my father. That $45,000 funeral bill was the absolute last cent I will ever spend on this toxic bloodline. I bought your house, I saved your dignity, and I paid for his burial. That was my final payment to this family. Enjoy your estate, Catherine. You are entirely on your own now." I turned my back on her and walked away. The sharp clicking of my heels echoed down the corridor, a sound of absolute freedom. I walked out through the heavy glass doors of the federal courthouse, leaving Catherine weeping alone in the marble corridor. The crisp afternoon air hit my face, washing away the toxic residue of my family's desperate manipulation. I stepped into my waiting black town car, closed the door, and instructed the driver to take me back to Wall Street. The war was officially over, and the cleanup phase was about to begin. 6 months passed with the brutal, unstoppable efficiency of a well-oiled corporate machine. The federal justice system, armed with the pristine forensic audit I had provided, dismantled Jamal and Lauren's fraudulent empire piece by piece. There were no dramatic courtroom surprises or last-minute plea deals that spared them from the consequences of their own blinding arrogance. The trial was a mathematical slaughter, Jamal attempted to turn state's evidence against his own wife, offering to testify that Lauren was the sole mastermind behind the offshore shell companies. The federal prosecutors laughed at him. The cybersecurity logs proving he orchestrated the server breach to steal proprietary trade secrets cemented his fate as the primary architect of the economic espionage. The judge sentenced Jamal to 7 years in a federal penitentiary. The man who had worn bespoke Navy suits and flaunted a solid gold Rolex was permanently stripped of his vanity and handed a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His venture capital firm was legally dissolved, his assets were seized by the government, and his reputation was permanently annihilated in the financial sector. Lauren fared no better in front of the judge. Her defense attorney tried to paint her as a naive, manipulated housewife who simply did not understand the complex wire transfers she was authorizing on a daily basis. The judge rejected that narrative entirely, pointing directly to the millions of dollars she had aggressively spent on luxury cars, designer wardrobes, and private European vacations, while the manufacturing plant employees faced imminent layoffs. Lauren was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The golden child who had spent her entire life expecting the world to bow to her absolute entitlement was escorted from the courtroom in heavy steel handcuffs, crying hysterically as the reality of a 6 by 8 foot concrete cell finally registered in her mind. The collateral damage of their federal convictions struck my mother with devastating precision. Lauren's high-priced defense lawyers required exorbitant cash retainers just to walk into the courtroom. With her bank accounts frozen by the federal government, Lauren had begged Catherine to liquidate everything to keep her out of prison. Catherine, completely blinded by her toxic devotion to her favorite daughter, sold the sprawling suburban estate. The massive mansion with the grand foyer, the crystal chandeliers, and the manicured lawns was auctioned off to cover the mounting legal debts and federal restitution orders. Catherine was forced to move into a small, cramped 2-bedroom apartment in an undesirable industrial zip code. Her elite country club memberships were immediately revoked. Her wealthy status, obsessed friends, stopped returning her phone calls, treating her like a highly contagious social pariah after the publicized federal trial. The woman who had proudly called me a failure in front of her high society peers was now spending her days sitting on a cheap sofa in a tiny living room entirely alone, surrounded by cardboard moving boxes she lacked the energy to unpack. She had traded her financial security to protect a criminal, and she was left with absolutely nothing. I did not attend the sentencing hearings. I did not visit my mother's new apartment. I was entirely focused on the future. I stood in my sleek, glass-walled chief executive officer suite on the top floor of the newly rebranded Reynolds Industries corporate headquarters. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, unobstructed view of the glittering city skyline. The office was designed to my exact specifications. It was minimalist, highly functional, and completely devoid of the bloated, useless luxury my sister had previously insisted upon. Over the past 6 months, I had successfully integrated the manufacturing company into a major Wall Street portfolio. I cleared the remaining operational bottlenecks, modernized the supply chain algorithms, and secured 3 massive international distribution contracts. The company was no longer a struggling family-run liability. It was a streamlined, aggressively profitable corporate powerhouse. The heavy glass door to my office opened smoothly. David Thorne walked in carrying 2 steaming cups of premium dark roast coffee and a thick, leather-bound financial portfolio. Our chief financial officer looked remarkably different than he had 6 months ago. The permanent exhaustion and paralyzing fear that used to shadow his face were completely gone. He looked 10 years younger, operating with the sharp, confident energy of an executive who finally had the resources and the leadership required to do his job effectively. "Good morning," Cassidy, David said, handing me a coffee cup and placing the leather portfolio squarely on the center of my pristine glass desk. "I just received the finalized data from the accounting department. I thought you would want to review the quarterly earnings report immediately." I took a sip of the coffee, letting the rich, bitter taste ground me in the moment. I opened the portfolio and scanned the top sheet. The numbers were absolute perfection. Gross revenue was up 42%. The Ohio manufacturing plant, the exact facility Lauren had tried to sell for a fraction of its value, was currently operating at 120% efficiency. We had not laid off a single factory worker. In fact, we had just authorized a comprehensive benefits expansion for the entire assembly line staff. Record profits across all major divisions. David noted a proud, genuine smile spreading across his face. The Wall Street integration was seamless. The market valuation of Reynolds Industries has nearly tripled since you officially assumed the executive position. We are dominating the sector. Excellent work, David, I replied, closing the portfolio with a solid, satisfying snap. Authorize the quarterly bonuses for the floor managers. Let us keep this momentum going into the next fiscal year. David nodded, turning to head back to his own office to execute the directives. I picked up my coffee and walked back over to the massive glass windows. The morning sun was climbing higher over the skyscrapers, casting brilliant golden light across the urban landscape. I looked out over the empire I had rightfully earned. There was no more manipulation. There were no more lies, no more toxic comparisons, and no more emotional blackmail. I had walked into a burning building, calculated the exact mathematics of survival, and emerged completely unscathed. The scapegoat was dead. I was the apex predator now, and the view from the top was absolutely spectacular. The profound story of Audrey's exclusion from her family's annual retreat teaches us a vital lesson about self-worth and boundaries. When others refuse to make space for you, you must find the courage to create your own. It is a devastating reality when the people who are supposed to support you instead prioritize a carefully curated image of perfection over your well-being. Audrey's family deliberately pushed her aside, viewing her recent life struggles as an inconvenience rather than a call for empathy. However, the most empowering takeaway from her journey is how she chose to respond. Instead of begging for inclusion or lashing out in destructive revenge, she strategically reclaimed her dignity. By hosting her own gathering next door, Audrey demonstrated that standing up for yourself is often as simple as refusing to accept the negative narrative others try to force upon you. Her experience illustrates that true family goes far beyond shared DNA or obligatory holiday traditions. It is fundamentally rooted in genuine love, mutual respect, and the willingness to make room for one another. When you build a space grounded in authenticity and joy, the people who truly value you will naturally gravitate toward it. Ultimately, we cannot control the limitations or toxic behaviors of our relatives, but we can completely control our own environment and the boundaries we set. You do not have to shrink yourself to fit into a room where you are tolerated rather than celebrated. If you ever find yourself undervalued by those closest to you, take a step back and start building your own sanctuary today.